fine. How about you?
Good.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the second day of the 554th Board Meeting of the California Regional Water Quality Control Board, Central Valley Region. I'd like to introduce the board members and staff at this time. On my far left is Raji Barr of Bakersfield. And I owe Raji a great apology that I'll make in public. There was a meeting yesterday at 9 o'clock here, and I didn't tell Raji that it was canceled. She and I were to attend the meeting. She got up at 4:45 yesterday to start driving up here. Told Raji I owe her a dinner for that.
And drinks.
Sitting next to Raji is Carmen Ramirez of Atwater. Directly on my left is John Constantino of Grass Valley. On my far right is Dan Markham of Fall River Mills. Sitting next to Dan is Bob Schneider of Davis, and sitting on my direct right is the Vice Chair, Denise Cadera of Allensworth. My name is Carl Longley from Fresno. I'll now introduce Pamela Creedon, the Executive Officer, who will introduce her staff.
Good morning, Dr. Longley, members of the board. Across the room, we have Andrew Altavot, Assistant Executive Officer of the Sacramento office, and next to Andrew is Stephanie Yu, Staff Counsel for the board. And to my immediate right is David Lancaster, Staff Counsel for the board. To my far left is Kieran Lanfranchi Rizzardi, Executive Assistant for the board. And next to Kieran is Adam Lapitz, Assistant Executive Officer in our Sacramento office. And next to me is Patrick Palupa, Senior Staff Counsel for the board. And in the audience, we just have Linda Bracamonte Karkowski, and she's an Assistant Executive Officer in the Sacramento office, and Clint Schneider from Redding and Clay Rogers from Fresno. They're both in meetings downtown at State Board this morning instead of being here. And just to let you know, Dr. Longley, Member Dodak is in the audience today, so she will be able to give ours.
Thank you very much. And we'll be talking with her very soon. Moving to agenda item 11, in order to conduct our regional, did we have anything else on 10 before I left it? No. We have the pledge, yes. John?
Please stand.
Thank you. Now we can go to 11. In order to conduct our regional board meetings in a fair and efficient manner, we'll be proceeding in accordance with the meeting procedures that have been provided with a summary agenda and are available here at the staff table. They're also available on a request and are posted on the board's website, and they are summarized on the computer screens during breaks. Any questions or comments regarding these procedures may be directed to Corinne Lanfranchi Rizzardi, our administrative assistant sitting here at the staff table. Moving on to agenda item 12, board member communications.
Can I?
Sure.
I wasn't here yesterday, so I wanted to announce that I had a meeting with Golden State Clean Energy. They're putting together trying to put together a solar project in the Westlands district. And we had a meeting. There's nothing pending in front of the board. It was just an informational item that I attended on Wednesday the 6th.
Thank you, John. And this is board member communications, agenda item 12. Do you have anything else? Good. As I stated yesterday, we got a lot of nice decorations here in this room for the holiday season. They are put together by Christina Job, who is Mary Ann Walton's daughter. She always decorates this room on her own resources, and she creates those bows by herself, and they are beautiful, and we certainly give her our thanks. Is there any other comments by board members? Seeing none, I'll give mine. On 25 25, 26 October, I participated in the WQCC meeting that was held down at the State Board. 27 October, I participated in an interview conducted by Stephanie Lucero and pertaining to the Central Valley Water Board strategic planning process. 1 and 2 November, I attended the annual California Bioresources Alliance meeting. Presentations tended to focus on safe uses of composting materials for agriculture and landscaping applications, and one of the presenters was Adam. That was held in West Sac. On 1 November, I attended a meeting with the Central Valley Board and State Water Board Management regarding the San Luis Drain Settlement. On 2 November, I attended a workshop regarding mercury-impaired reservoirs that was held at Cal EPA. On 6 November, I participated in a SALTI 5 meeting. It was a conference call. 7 November, I participated in a meeting of the Food Safety Panel here in this room. On 8 November, I participated in an Essential Element meeting, a meeting focused this year on enhancing economic competitiveness in the San Joaquin Valley by greatly increasing the availability and use of broadband. Broadband availability greatly enhances feasibility for effective water management, monitoring, and data collection and reporting. That was held at the Harris Ranch Conference Facility. 15 November, I attended the Environmental Justice meeting hosted by the State Water Resources Control Board. 27 November, attended a workshop presented by the State Water Resources Control Board regarding the East San Joaquin General Order that was petitioned to them by several parties. This was held in the workshop was held in the Veterans Memorial Building in Clovis. 29 November, I attended a meeting regarding coordination between the Corps and this board when operations on dredging were taking place. That was held. Adam, Patrick, and Pamela were at the meeting. This was held at the Corps of Engineer offices in San Francisco. 4 December, participating in a meeting pertaining to the East San Joaquin General Order with the State Water Board staff. And 5 December, participated in the State Water Board presentation. The same thing that was spoke about yesterday. The presentation regarding maintaining a respectful work environment, this is an EEO compliance issue as required by AB 1825. It was a webinar and very useful, and I think particularly in the times we live in now, everybody should take it.
So Carl, I'll add that I was at the WQCC. I didn't include it because it's a public meeting, and so there's not much to disclose. And then I also took the webinar on the EEOC, but didn't include that either because that's just sort of a thing. But I did, since you mentioned them, I'll mention them as well.
Good. Any further comments?
Well, I'd like to say that I took that EEOC training online as well.
Good.
Ditto.
Seems like the board has taken it. So, good. Okay. Well, Bob mentioned it yesterday, so.
Well, not only did I take it, I really enjoyed it. It was really good. I had a good presenter, and it was
I did
engaging.
too. Yeah, it was good.
That could be very, very boring. But it's true with any course you take, or oftentimes it's the presenter makes it, puts the material out there in a manner that makes you listen.
So Dr. Longley, you did mention Stephanie Lucero. She is here in the audience. She's met some of you may not. She's here observing the board meeting today. So I just wanted to let you know they're busy working on the project for us, and hopefully we'll have a good report and some recommendations for the board.
And one item I didn't mention, on 29 November, I attended it was held at UC Berkeley, but sponsored by DWR and some other folks, a one-day workshop on data management, and this is focused on, I forget the number of the bill, but it's the Open Data Act. And we are going to have some real challenges in the future as we work to comply with this. Challenges because, first of all, it's going to take funding, PYs, that we don't have today. But in the long run, I'm hopeful that this will be successful. It's something that is needed to give transparency to our data, make our data accessible to the public at large. And to us, quite frankly, not because it means you'd be able to look at the Fed's data and everybody else's data out there. Very good. We'll move on to agenda item 13. Do we have any? This is the public forum.
Dr. Longley,
You have
item
some-
5.
Pardon?
Item 5 with Board Member Dodak.
Okay, we'll move back to that. Item 5, update by State Board Member Tam Dudek. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Creedon. Thank you, board
You're
members.
right. I'd be an abject failure if it wasn't for Pamela.
Having known Ms. Creedon for quite a while, I might have to agree with that statement. Thank you. Good morning. I don't have much of an update to provide since I have been so engaged with your staff and some of you over the past month or so on a variety of issues that I assume that you're up to date on our activities with respect to the East San Joaquin order, as well as the SEP policy that was recently approved, as well as other things that are coming up before the board, the state board. So let me just take this moment to, first of all, wish you happy holidays, I guess early, and also thank you for the tremendous service and the tremendous work that you do on this board on behalf of all the citizens of California. As I've had a chance to interact more with your staff than I had earlier this year on a variety of issues that are coming before the state board that is relevant to this regional board, it always enhances and reaffirms for me the incredible challenge that you face dealing with the myriad of issues across this broad region and the complexities as well as the different stakeholders, personalities, communities that are involved in this issue. And while I don't appreciate often the petition process and the things that the state board does and its role with the regional water boards, the one thing that I will say is it allows us to, for a short time, walk in your shoes and experience and consider some of the issues that you have to consider on monthly as well, I guess for Dr. Longley on a daily basis. And I just wanted to say how much I appreciate, and know the state board also, my colleagues, appreciate the work that you do. And one of the things that I if you will spare me the time, I'll take a moment to mention right now is it occurred to me over the course of the last few months of engaging with your staff on some of these issues that perhaps that appreciation does not reflect, is not appropriately reflected in some of the staff drafts that are issued out there. And I want to assure you that that is certainly not the case, that while we may have differences in perspective and opinions, reasonable people can agree, can disagree, that there is always a level of deep respect and a recognition of the service and the expertise that you bring to these issues. So as we continue into the next few months, especially as we continue forward on items that I know are of great deal of significance to this region, I would encourage your staff and all of you, to the extent that you are able to. We all have constraints with respect to ex parte, but I would appreciate, and I know we've started to have those discussions in areas where we can, that we work together, and to the extent that things are not reflective, I think, of the common respect that we hold for each other, our respective roles, as well as our common objectives, we really need to get that straightened out.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And we too are very happy with the kind of representation that you provide for us on the state board. Certainly, you and I have worked together for a long time, probably longer than we care to admit. But it is interesting to watch how, particularly the Irrigated Lands Program, how it has evolved from the early part of the century to where it is today. And we'll see where it goes. It's certainly a challenge. I don't know of any other state in this nation that has undertaken such a significant effort to protect water quality with agriculture. At the same time, other states don't have the water shortage issues that we do, and I'm thinking more of the East Coast states. And that certainly, this whole issue is certainly compounded by the very unique climatic region in which we live, and how to resolve the problems that face us: water supply, water quality, a growing population, and a large dependence upon this area for agricultural products. The social issues we have with the people that harvest those goods from the field and others, all of this is a very difficult mix to try to handle, and I certainly thank you for your leadership in trying to address this huge, don't want to call it a burden, this whole responsibility. Exactly. Thank you, John. So.
Oh, it takes a team, and that team is not only a team at the state board, but a team of state and regional board members as well as staff working together.
Thank you. Any questions? Yeah, go
No,
ahead,
just
John.
happy holidays back to you, and extend those wishes to everybody else at the state board.
So I would like to just say that they do have a new executive director, Eileen Sobek, and Eileen has really reached out, and I just truly appreciate her efforts in trying to reach out to the regional board. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Tam. Move on to agenda item, not 6. It's here. We had nobody on the public forum. Does anybody wish to speak to the board in any matter that's not on the agenda today? Seeing none. Okay, we'll go to agenda item 14. Executive Officer's Report.
Dr. Longley, unless there are any questions, I have nothing to add to the report today.
We have no questions. That takes us to agenda item 15, uncontested calendar.
But Dr. Longley, before you do that, on the public forum, we did receive an email letter today from Assemblyman Gallagher.
Yes.
It was received yesterday? Oh. It was supposed to be during the public forum. It is a letter regarding the item you did hear during the public forum yesterday on the Placer, Nevada, South Sutter.
We all have copies of that letter.
So it's,
yeah.
I don't know how we proceed with that. I have to look to Patrick if we just read it or just acknowledge that we've accepted it.
I would suggest that we just acknowledge that we've accepted it, and that the board will be considering the issues relating to the Placer, Nevada, South Sutter, North Sacramento Subwatershed Group. And I only knew that because it's in front of me right now.
And I think they need to find an acronym that we can pronounce. But with that said, unless I have opposition, I'll go ahead and I'll rule that this be adopted into the record with the consent of my board members. Yes. Good. So done. We'll move on. Go ahead, Adam.
For the uncontested calendar, I'd like to add items 16 for the City of Tracy wastewater treatment plant and item 17, Donner Summit Public Utility District, to the item 15 consideration of the uncontested calendar.
Okay. We don't object.
So Dr. Longley, I'd like to move to approve the uncontested calendar as presented with the addition of number 17.
16 and 17?
16 and 17.
Are there any late revisions?
There are no late revisions.
Wonderful. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Dr. Longley, you didn't read the hearing procedures for this, or is there anyone in the audience that is here that we're not aware of?
There is not a hearing procedure with it.
Item 15?
A hearing script.
There's no script.
Yes.
This is time and place for a public hearing to consider adoption of uncontested items 23 through 25,
Adding 16 and 17?
and 16 and 17.
I don't know if there's anyone in the audience that you...
Oh, does
you-
anyone wish to discuss any of these items?
Just to make sure.
We already know about late revisions. I'll close the hearing. We have a motion. It's been moved by Carmen, seconded by John. Roll call.
Ms. Ramirez? Mr. Costantino? Ms. Brar?
Aye.
Mr. Schneider? Dr. Markham?
Aye.
Ms. Kadara? Dr. Longley?
Aye.
Motion carries.
Agenda item 18. At this time, the board will hear a presentation by Ms. Lori Wayburn, President and co-founder of Pacific Forest Trust, on risk management of California's key source watershed infrastructure. This is an information item only, and no action will be taken, although the board may ask questions and provide direction to staff. After the board presentation, interested persons will be allowed 3 minutes each to address the board. We will now hear the presentation by Ms. Washburn. Wayburn, excuse. Somebody put Washburn in my minutes. I'm in my script. I'm sorry.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you, and I'm particularly honored that I get to be on the last day of your work year, and I'll start with the best, which is wishing you happy holidays.
Thank you.
I think actually, Dr. Longley, you identified in your interaction with the commissioner or the board member Dudek about why the work that we're doing is so important, and that is that this region is the single most critical region of the state for water supply and reliability. And it is for that reason that my organization is doing the project Healthy Watersheds California. And this is a project that has embodies the state's goals around both climate and adaptation and resilience and water security. Pacific Forest Trust is an organization that is dedicated to supporting forests for all the values that they provide and expanding the suite of sources of return for landowners from those we've traditionally relied upon, which are timber, to include the values for habitat, for climate, and in this case, for water. And in fact, those three values of habitat, climate, and water are synergistic. They are complementary to timber production. And by managing our forests for those four values together, we actually have a much greater chance of having adaptation successfully under climate change. So as you all know well, this is the top of the fountain for the state. This region provides 60% of the irrigated agricultural water and 90% of the irrigated water for prime agricultural land. It's 80 to 85% of the freshwater into San Francisco Bay, and depending upon the year, it can be 45% or more of Los Angeles's water, 20% of San Diego's. Writ large, between the Central Valley and the State Water Project, it's drinking water for 28 million Californians. So the central core of the project that we are discussing is to treat the watersheds comparably to how we treat the rest of the infrastructure of the state water system. And that is because while we can envision infrastructure in a built context and design projects for the whole of that, and we have a system for financing the repair and maintenance of our built system, we have not had such either a recognition of, a system to plan for, a system to finance, or a system to implement the kind of repair and maintenance for the source water infrastructure on which the built infrastructure of our water system relies. Yet we know that if we did that, we could substantially and at much lower cost have higher security and reliability of water by restoring a more natural hydrograph. There are many other benefits that flow from that as well, economically, socially, culturally within this region. For that reason, we worked with Assemblymember Richard Bloom to pass a law last year, AB 2480, which actually recognized source watersheds as critical infrastructure for the water system and enabled their financing to be treated the same way that we finance repair and maintenance of the built infrastructure. So the slide that I put up here is one that you all will recognize. It's the Oroville Dam and flood. By restoring our wet meadows, we can decrease flood intensity anywhere from 10 to 40%. Had we done that, we might not have had this flood, or we certainly wouldn't have had it at this intensity. This is Shasta at the peak of the drought. We know that by addressing how forests collect, retain water, can increase water supplies anywhere, if you believe Roger Bales, 9 to 16%. Other people could take it down lower or higher. We would not have had the drought impacts to this extent either. So the region that I'm speaking of is 7 million acres. It is the 5 watersheds that feed the Oroville and the Shasta. That's the Feather, the Pitt, which is the unrecognized and unsung hero of water in California, the McCloud, the Upper Sac, and the Upper Trinity. All of these drain into the Sacramento, as you know, and are within the suite of responsibilities that you all have some care over. One reason why this region is so critically important is that over the past 125 years, it has remained colder and wetter than the rest of the state. There was an excellent study done out of UC Berkeley, meta-analysis of some 200 studies, all documented this. So when the dams were put in this region, they were put with a good reason. This is where the water was. What's even more important is that this is where the water will be. In working with Dr. Jim Thorne out of UC Davis, he looked at that same region over that same time period, looking at that critical measure of moisture, the climactic water deficit, and that's a measure of stress on plants from water. And you can see that this is an area that is incredibly robust compared to the rest of the state and how it has been warming and drying. This continues through. So he's done projections under both the cold and dry scenarios of global warming up to the warm and wet scenarios of global warming. This region remains cooler and wetter than the rest of the state. So when you look at this, and I put up here one of the outcomes of his work, which is on groundwater recharge. As you all know, the Pitt has a significant spring-fed component that is reliant on groundwater recharge. This region remains the groundwater recharge for the state. So in terms of water supply, not only is it from precipitation, but it's also from recharge. One of the interesting things about the warm and wet scenario is that if soils in the Pitt are warm longer, there's even greater recharge. From a habitat perspective, a really interesting phenomenon here, and one that really bears through in terms of our recommendations about management of this region comprehensively for source water infrastructure, is that this region's habitats have high persistence under climate change. So what this highly colorful map shows, it's kind of like a cancer map in some respects. What's important to look at is the black outline of the watershed region. Habitats persist in this region. That means that restoration activities in this region will pay off because those natural forests will remain as forests if we put the effort into them to restore more natural forest function. And this is just another way of looking at that same issue. It's looking at the high and the low scenarios under global warming. Where will we have refugia from a habitat perspective? And so in other words, where will wildlife be moving? Where will wildlife be able to persist under climate change? This region stands out amongst all of those in the state. So if we're looking at how do we have a resilient source watershed, what do we need to do? Again, I think you're all familiar with this. One solution is to restore the kinds of forests that both attract and hold more precipitation. And what I mean by that is that an even canopy, when you have water blow all, many of you have walked outside on a cloudy day and you feel the water on your face. Well, when you have an uneven canopy, when the winds move through it, it causes turbulence and condensation. You capture up to 25% more water with a more natural canopy structure. With an even closed canopy, you lose up to 70% of the snow to transpiration, evaporation. With that, with a more natural you can capture up to 20% more snow. So if you're thinking about attracting and retaining more water, one solution is to restore a more natural forest structure across the landscape through ongoing management. Another is to restore our degraded streams, whether it's from banks being broken down or whether it is from channelization in the past when we thought it was a good idea to move water as quickly as possible through meadows to move it downstream. In the wet meadow arena, we know these are our natural sponges. These are key to restoring the natural hydrograph. And why that's important, as you all know well, is if we can extend cold water later into the season when both agriculture and fish need it more, that's extraordinarily valuable. Wet meadows are key to that. So if you're attracting and retaining snow and water longer in the forest and you're holding it in your meadows longer, you have an extension of 6 to 8 weeks in the cold water season. Another is to reduce the sediment delivery, again, whether it is from herd management to restore stream banks or to reduce the sediment from catastrophic fire. The shovel there is 1 year after the rim fire, the amount of sediment deposited in 1 year. That's an impressive amount of sediment. Another solution is to have more cohesive management across our boundaries. This is along I-5 at Castle Crags. And you can see that the map and the territory show very, very different ways of managing the landscape, and somewhat more homogeneity across that can help those forests function more resiliently. And key within that is limiting fragmentation. We need to have more planned development within our communities and less out into the forest. And I think you all may be familiar with Forest Service research. The single most desirable place to build is looking over water in the forest, all on your own, in the stream or reservoir. This is on the side of the Feather at Oroville. So decreasing fragmentation and maintaining the forest into the long term, integrity is really important for how forests function. Net, if we can invest in this region as we would invest in our built infrastructure, we've done an analysis that shows that 50% of these forests are in significant risk, whether from fire, from fragmentation, from conversion. And when you invest and put the effort in to promote the resiliency here, you get responses. I was down yesterday talking with Los Angeles Water and Power around this because, of course, they use this water. They depend upon this water. And they're the first to say, watershed restoration works. We've seen it. We've invested $2 billion in watershed restoration, and we see the results over on the east side. This is just a series of slides of Squaw Creek, a tributary to the McCloud, where work had been done to do vegetation management for fuels reduction, restoring prescribed fire, more natural structure and canopy. And what you see is the bounce back in a year from what would be a devastated situation to a very robust one. So you each have copies of the risk analysis that we've done. And within that, we walk through what are the benefits that we get from working with our natural infrastructure. And whether it is greater water yield, a more restored hydrograph, colder water, more water for environmental purposes, less degradation, or frankly, we didn't put it here, but there would be 7,000 jobs that would be supported through a comprehensive approach to restoration within this region. And if one thinks about Modoc County, Siskiyou County, Shasta County, the kinds of impacts that that stable employment would have are really significant. So key to this is the idea of working with the whole. Just as none of you would say, let's build a dam by putting in 2 cinder blocks 1 year and some rebar another year, we have to envision the whole. This is the Feather River watershed. We have to think from the top to the bottom. This is Shasta to the dam at Shasta. And in recognizing that continuity, we can have far greater impact, synergistically beneficial impact. This is just a summary of the kinds of acreages that we're looking at here for work. It's roughly 3 million acres of forest that we are recommending for fuels management and restoration of prescribed or managed fire. It's 29,000 miles of unpaved road that are sedimentation source. These are significant problems that can be dealt with. There's a series of maps on our website. We did 5 maps of the analysis for each of these watersheds about the work to be done in the forests, on the roads, in the wet and dry meadows, in the streams, and to prevent the degradation of the integrity of the watersheds. This is just an example on the McLeod. Here in the Upper Trinity, the road situation in the Trinity, I think you're fairly familiar with, highly erodible soils. The Pit, the unsung hero, as I say, the unrecognized champion of water delivery. The Sacramento was originally named the Pit before they named it the Sacramento, and one could say that that was still valid. And the Feather, which has an incredible amount of impact in terms of the stream work to be done there. And then on the Upper Sacramento, this is just an example of how we could ensure that this landscape remained as forest, working across public and private boundaries, but maintaining it as working forest. From a cost point of view, thinking about new sources of water in the state, this is an example that's probably very familiar to all of you. When New York was faced with a water quality issue, less than a quantity issue, the choice of either $8 billion in new water infrastructure to ensure water quality or $1.5 billion through working with a natural infrastructure, they chose the $1.5 billion. They haven't even spent $1 billion, and they've attained their goals. So from a cost-effective point of view, and then looking at this from the point of view of, is there anything in water we can all agree on? This is something we can all agree on, whether you're a dog fanatic like I am, whether you like to see people employed in rural regions, whether you're about habitat, or whether you're about water security. And just very briefly, I want to tie this to our work on climate. We're entering into another potentially ridiculously rigid ridge situation, resilient ridge, sorry. We know that the patterns in this state are changing, and they are changing across the country and across the world. When we look at these scenarios out of the IPCC, everybody looks at the green curve and says, that's gone, we'll never get there. There is one way we can get there, and that is through working with land to restore the kind of carbon richness and resilience to land, and to engage much more of our rural community in this, and to create an economy that supports working with the land for those climate benefits. This is something that working with water is a key strategy. So source watersheds are a key strategy in terms of the kind of climate work we need to do. Forests are a key part of the governor and the state's plan. There are a number of estimates that say 50% of the solution is through forests. We could certainly contribute to that out of this state. Key to that is reducing land fragmentation, restoring more natural structure and resilience, and reforestation where forests belong. And all of these are key tools that we're recommending within this. This also has the synergistic benefits with habitat. And this can be a model. If you look across the country, what could we be doing to reduce CO2 levels by working with forests? Just imagine if we reforested along the Mississippi and the Missouri. But you could do 1 to 1.5 billion tons of CO2 reductions annually. So there's benefit here directly to water, but there are also tremendous synergistic benefits in other sectors. And that's water security for a growing California. This is something, Dr. Longley, that you were mentioning earlier. We need water security. This is a cost-effective and known way to help procure that. And so with that, I'd like to say thank you and take any questions.
Questions for board members? Comments?
I have a few comments. First, I have to say I've had the pleasure of having an acquaintance with Ms. Wayburn for some odd 50 years, I think, since her parents worked on the formation and establishment of the Redwood National Park, and it's been a pleasure. And I followed the establishment and history of the Pacific Forest Trust and the leadership that they provide now, and that's a great compliment to Lorraine County's work on that, the co-founders. So thank you. I mean, what Lori's talking about is public-private, nonprofit business partnerships in our region, and I think one of the wonderful things that this board has done is partner with the Rose Foundation and their granting ability with underserved communities throughout the San Joaquin, in particular with water issues. And I think that this working with in our region with the Pacific Forest Trust as we move forward and if we find ways that we can really engage in a partnership with the work and the organization that Pacific Forest Trust is, I think will be to everybody's benefit. So I look forward to exploring that relationship as we move forward, and I really appreciate the presentation and starting that. I will say that in the maps, and you look, I mostly work in the Northern Intercoast Range, which is anchored at the north by the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument and the south by the Berryessa Snow Mountain National Monument. Much of the forests through that range are largely unfragmented, and there's a lot of forests in that region also that needs help. And I do appreciate that our forest unit under Angela has participated, for instance, in the Firescape Mendocino stakeholder process, and I think that provides a lot of background information for both forest health, water management enhancement, and also climate adaptation as we move forward. So I think these goals are key in the northern part of our region in particular, and I look forward to exploring that over the years. So thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you for your comments, Bob. It is so critical that we find a way to accomplish the ways to work together to accomplish the kind of goals that you set forth. You brought up a lot of issues. The one that comes always to my mind, though, is the ravaging effect that uncontrolled wildfire has when it's not part of the larger plan, the impacts on our streams and so forth. And of course, all those who use the stream, whether it's wildlife or people or little critters. So how we do that, I think, is important. We need to find ways to work together. John, did you have some comments?
Yeah, so Lori, thank you for the presentation. Happy holidays to you. And I live in the forest. I live up in Grass Valley. And my day job is all about climate change. And so I work with the forest offset folks. So there's always crossover between water and climate, but it seems like forests are sort of front and center for that. We do a lot of forestry work here, a lot of forestry work in the climate sectors, and it's been the most interesting, I think, part of what I've learned since I've been on the board is the whole forestry infrastructure and everything from our tours up in Reading to the discussions and presentations like today. So really appreciate and fully support everything that you guys are working on, because it is the statistics that you show. I think Carmen gasped at when you had all those statistics about 80-90% of the water, and it is amazing. So appreciate the work. Thank you.
And what I was going to say is that what a great and energizing way to start the morning. I mean, this feels like just a hopeful and exciting frontier that is available, and we need to think through. So what I was going to ask is if I can get in touch with you after the meeting. I'd like to give you my email. I'd like to get a copy of the presentation. But more than that, I'd like to maybe talk with you about maybe how some of these same principles apply to an area that I live closer to, so in Mariposa and up in Coors Gold and that kind of area. Because we just had terrible fires up there. I know that that's going to affect, water quality in the streams, and, I don't know that we've got, sort of the workhorse rivers up there, but they certainly are critical, the cold waters that come down to supply water in the valley. So this is something that I'm really excited about, really interested in, so I'd like to talk more with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, Ms. Wayburn, I appreciated hearing your presentation. It was, everything you said was just, like Carmen said, it was just mouth-dropping just to hear some of the things that you shared. But one of the things that I heard in there was the cost. The cost of restoring the forest is far less than the money that you spend in other ways with the concrete channels and all of that. So, and money has been made available, and as you said, the cost was far less. So I'm really interested in seeing how we can all work together to work in this process, because it is going to determine our future for water. So thank you very much for your presentation. It was great.
I'll just do an aside and say one of the ways that we can help is to support the Parks Bond on the next June ballot, because I don't know if we can take positions, but it will certainly help our work and the work in the forests. So.
We'll work with the Office of Legislative Affairs to see if we can't get the Water Board to weigh in on their support. I have a question for you because of the new legislation, because I was really, we were supportive of this. Jim Brannaman with the Sierra Nevada Conservation was active in trying to get this legislation through. But does that legislation come with special funding or special attention to funding going towards this work?
So that legislation does not come with dollars. What it comes with is the ability to work with the existing financing system for the state water system. There are two things I'd like to ask that you consider. One way that we could work together is that if you might consider a general permit for the restoration activities. This is one of the real challenges in doing work, is getting all the permits associated with that. That if we might work together to develop the conditions of a general permit for work to be done in this region, because there are the 1,600 permits in the 401. Those are things that, because permits have been developed in general to circumscribe private economic activity in favor of protecting some public benefit resources. When you're doing restoration, you're focusing on public benefit resources. So if we might look at the permitting system together to think about a general permit, that would be something that we'd love to work with you on. The other thing is that from the funding point of view, we are looking at a public-private partnership to support what the work here would be. Rough estimates, you might be looking at $3.5 to $4 billion. That's not an overwhelming price tag if you think about it over a 10-year period. That's somewhere in $400 million a year. If that were a partnership between the state with coordinated investments on the state side of funding that the state does control in the water arena and the greenhouse gas reduction benefits arena, and in existing grant programs that there are, and with financing half of it through revenue bonds, and that's something that we are talking with the Water Board about at the state level. This is something that can be done. And as I say, from the point of view of the water controversies in the state, there's intense controversy about the tunnel or the tunnels. There's no controversy about doing this work. Everybody supports doing this kind of work, whether it's Aqua or on out from there. And so I think that we can work together to make this happen. It's something that can happen. And I thank you very much for the opportunity to talk with you about it.
Thank you. And the other issue that I spoke briefly before this meeting with Bob about is this, and we're seeing this issue now in the fires going on in Southern California, is the interface between people and the forest. People want to live in the forest. Bob pointed out our zoning laws, planning laws have been pretty ineffective in this respect, but I'm paraphrasing what he said. But that, I think, is a critical issue as we go on also. Has a lot to do with the roads that are there to support them and a lot of other issues that occur when we get these wildfires. So
absolutely true.
I don't know how that is part of your package or not.
We do not, in this work, we're focused on the active restoration within the forest and the active conservation of that as working forest. And in most of the area, it is zoned as forest or general resource or timber production zone. This region has the most TPZ of any in the state, but we would be pleased if we can be helpful in any way around those discussions, because it is a county level. And I would be remiss, I would like to thank you very much for allowing us to work with your staff, Angeline Wilson, because she is terrific to work with, and she has been helpful to us in our Klamath Cascade Advisory Council and in a number of other issues. So thank you for allowing us to work with her.
Thank you for the compliment. John, do you have a question?
So there was a cute little animal on that last slide, and I couldn't figure out what it was.
It's a Pacific fisher.
Oh.
Yeah. So, you know, they're really interesting because they require large trees, and the mothers move their kits 4 or 5 times during their from birth to independence. And they are adorable, but don't let it fool you. They're really fierce. The Pacific fisher of the board.
Well, any further questions or comments? Thank you very much for an extremely interesting and very important presentation.
Well, thank you.
We will take a...
So, Dr. Longley?
Yes, ma'am.
We neglected to do the board calendar during the board communication period, so we handed out the proposed time. So if you could look at that during the break, and we can chat in just a couple minutes.
We'll chat about it as soon as we come back. We'll take a 10-minute break. Take our seats, please. We're ready to come back into session.
That's what I'm thinking about.
Yeah,
A little more readable.
Yeah.
We need Pamela and Denise for this.
So, are we gonna do the calendar first?
That's right.
we got to leave Pamela.
Okay, well, I'm gonna, I need to be over.
Well, since we have a minute, I'll say that, Kieran, happy holidays. Thank you for all that you do for the board, and you supply us with nutrients all day. And everybody's got their pet food. I think mine might be pretzels, and these are like really fresh and salty, so thank you.
You always have to clarify, I think that those are provided with funding from this board. It is not public money that goes into this.
Thanks, Bob.
But it's a public heart that does the distribution, and that's the best part. She puts a heart in it for us.
That's right. And I must endorse what John said. They are fresh. They are good. Good. Everybody's here. We have in front of us the proposed 2018 board meeting calendar. I don't know why they have to putting those little postscripts down there. Pamela's last meeting. I know that.
Everybody does.
But that's when we are going to, as things now stand, have the final CV Salts hearing. And we'll begin the hearing process on March 12th. Those are extremely critical dates. And those are January 19th and March 12th are in addition to what would be our normal regular board meetings. And they're there simply to be able to meet this deadline that, by the way, the February meeting was when we were originally intended to adopt CV SALT, but for a number of reasons it's been moved back or moved to the current time of May 31st, June 1st. So anybody have issues with any of these dates?
I have a question on the March 12th. It says begin CV Salts hearing. Do we anticipate that will go more than one day?
So
Like, do I need to block off 2 days?
no, that'll be the first day, and so it's like how we do our basin plan amendments. We open the hearing, and then it's continued. So we would complete that hearing on the May 31st.
And just to clarify, it's a comment hearing. That hearing is during the scheduled public comment period, and then the final hearing will be a separate hearing for the adoption of the Basin Plan Amendment to hear what is essentially summary arguments that summarize the comments that have already been received.
I had a question about, I had all these on my calendar except August 2nd and 3rd, and that's still tentative. Is that a real board meeting, or what's the plan there?
We normally have an August meeting.
Yeah. Board Member Constantino, sorry, over here. That was the meeting that it was originally scheduled for July, and at the board's October meeting, there was some discussion about the board with the board members present that there were some conflicts in July, and so at the October meeting, we had proposed those dates in August, and we wanted to make sure that the full board had a chance to weigh in and make sure that the August dates would work.
Okay, so since we're talking about it, those dates work for me.
Okay.
The April 5th and 6th in Fresno do not anymore, and I think I sent a note to that effect, and I know I said yes once, but now I say no. So if that has to be the date, then I fully understand that. But
Okay.
Well, is there some flexibility then, John? What would work for you?
the week before is spring break before Easter, so that's probably bad. The week after is fine. So
Be nice if all 7 of us could be there.
Well, if that's the goal, then the week after doesn't work for me. So the third week, the 18th, 19th, 20th, that week works.
So we got to be conscious of the time between our board meetings. It takes a tremendous amount of time for document preparation and proper noticing of the board meetings, so.
We're moving up if we get
Then we're
into April
pushing it.
too far. It's getting too close to the May 31st meeting. I
I think we stay.
think we need to stay where it is, right?
It's okay. I was just trying to see if there's flexibility.
Exactly.
And so the only other thing I'll say is that the CV salt's on the 12th. I have a jury trial the 5th through the 9th, and so we anticipate that we'll be done by that Friday. But if we don't, then the 12th is the return day. So, I mean, I can't do anything about scheduling any better
The
than that.
12th is the
March 12th.
Is the return day.
What I'm saying is that I'm going to be in trial from the 5th. We estimate a closing day of the trial on the 9th, Friday. If it goes longer, then I'll be busy on the 12th and
Oh,
not
I
be able
see.
to attend CV salts.
I would note for that meeting, we will be able to prepare a transcript. And since it is a hearing to receive comments, we'd be able to provide you that with the transcript in advance of the May 31, June 1 hearing date, so that you could fully consider everything that was said during the meeting on the 12th.
So, given the discussion we've had,
I do want to point out as well that the 19th is a board workshop. So as much as we want as many of you there as possible, a quorum is not absolutely necessary. We also are planning some additional workshops in the Clear Lake area because the pending Basin Plan Amendment process and the controversy with some of the environmental and tribal issues in that area. So we will bring the board to that area so you can hear all their concerns. So there will be additional workshops. We just don't have those scheduled right now. And then also similar
We
to
know
what
about when there will be. What month?
it'll be in the first 6 months of 2018, so anytime between January and June. And then also the federal government is proposing to use retinone in 33 water bodies, and we had that similar approach up in Lake Davis in Plumas County a few years ago, and it was very, very controversial. So we're working with workshops with them and making sure we bring the public in, and we may have board workshops in that area so you can hear the public and their concerns about that. This actually ends up creating a kill zone in water bodies to eliminate the invasive species, and then they so that the native species can thrive. So
this is what happened in Lake Davis,
Yes.
8 years ago, 10 years ago maybe?
we did it twice. The first time was a
Yeah.
failure, and the second time has been successful.
But we held a workshop up there,
Twice, yes, we did.
yeah. So,
So we want to try and do this one with lessons learned from Lake Davis, because we need to issue a permit for them to do this work.
right.
And we usually don't issue permits for allowing them to kill fish, so this is what it's happening. It's killing aquatic life.
So we have this proposed 2018 board meeting calendar in front of us. Had comments on this. We've been informed that during the first 6 months of 2018, there will be at least one and maybe more meetings in the Clear Lake area. We also may have a workshop sometime during the year on the use of rotenone by the federal government. But those are not scheduled yet. And in fact, the notes down below describe what I've just said. So do we need further discussion, or can we, at this point, accept this as our calendar? Do I have
Agreeable.
consensus?
It's okay.
I'm not going to take a roll call vote. I think we have consensus.
Yeah, I think that's appropriate. We'll put this on the website so the public can be aware of what we're proposing. Okay.
It would be useful as soon as possible to know when the WQCC meetings are next October, too.
Yeah, I'll bring it up at the next MCC to make sure we get that scheduled.
I just said that because Pam's in the room.
Okay. We'll then go back onto the agenda and move to agenda item 19. This is the time and place for a public hearing to consider an administrative civil liability order for assessment of mandatory minimum penalties for the original 16-to-1 mine in Sierra County. The designated parties for this proceeding are as follows: the board's prosecution team and the original 16-to-1 mine. All other parties are considered interested persons. The prosecution team has a combined total of 40 minutes for direct testimony, cross-examination, and a closing statement. Original 16-to-1 mine has a combined total of 35 minutes for the same. Interested persons shall limit their comments to 3 minutes, and a timer will be used. All persons expecting to testify, please stand at this time. Raise your right hand and take the following oath. Do you swear? Very good. Do you swear the testimony you're about to give is the truth? If so, answer I do. Thank you. At this time, evidence should be introduced on the following issues: whether the board should issue, reject, or modify the proposed ACL order. The order of this hearing is as follows. First, testimony by the prosecution team, then testimony by original 16-to-1 mine, followed by cross-examination of the prosecution team, then finally cross-examination original 16-to-1 mine. Second will be comments by interested persons. Third, closing statement by original 16-to-1 mine, followed by a closing statement from the prosecution team. Please state your name, address, affiliation, and whether you've taken the oath before you testify. If you haven't submitted a speaker card yet, now is the time to submit one to Ms. Lanfranca Rizzardi with her hand up here. Are there any procedural issues that the designated parties would like to raise at this time?
Good morning, Dr. Longley and members of the board. We have one issue to discuss. My name is Kaylin Ellison. I'm an attorney for the prosecution team. There seems to be some confusion about what the scope of this hearing is. It is just limited to MMPs. It does not include a discretionary component. And we're concerned that this could be an issue. We are contemplating and anticipate that there will be a subsequent enforcement action with discretionary penalties. So it is more important than in most cases that we limit the scope of this hearing to evidence and facts and testimony that is relevant to MMPs and exclude any facts, evidence, or information relevant to those discretionary penalties. And that's for a couple of reasons. First, it could prejudice the prosecution team in the subsequent enforcement action. And the evidence is not before the board today related to those discretionary penalties, so it wouldn't be appropriate for the board to make any sort of findings or statements relevant to those discretionary penalties. So in order to help the process of this hearing go smoothly, we ask for a ruling at the outset limiting the scope of this hearing just to what is relevant to the MMPs and not to what might be relevant to discretionary penalties alone.
Stephanie, could you advise, as the board's counsel, could you advise the board upon what the prosecution team is requesting?
Sure. So the prosecution team's request seems prudent to me. In fact, that's what has been noticed is only the MMPs for today's hearing.
And are you comfortable with us, with a ruling that would limit testimony to simply the MMPs?
Yes.
Carl, can I ask why the concern?
I guess my main concern is that if the discharger makes statements about the discretionary penalties, or there's any sort of comments made by the board, that the transcript for this hearing could be used as evidence in the subsequent enforcement action, and it could cause a problem if, when the board does have all the facts and information before them, there were inconsistencies in some of those statements. It could potentially be seen as pre-decisional statements being made by the board, or potentially binding on the board.
I see a gentleman standing. I presume you're counsel for the 1601 mine?
Yeah, I'm sorry. My name is Klaus Kolb. I'm here as an attorney representing the original 16-1 mine in this proceeding. My first response is the mine doesn't have any objection per se to limiting the testimony or the evidence to what's on the agenda today. The difficulty is in the description of what's relevant and what's not, and I don't know how the board can make a ruling on that without hearing what the specific evidence is that's going to be admitted. But there's no intent here to go beyond what's on the schedule, at least on the mine's behalf. In that context, let me say that I'm here today with basically a day's notice on this. The mine has tried to retain attorneys for this. There has been a request made to postpone this and a waiver of time so that they could get the regular staff on. I don't know if there's been a formal response to the letter from the mine's attorneys.
There was a formal response, and the delay was denied.
Okay. Well, then for the record, I would just say that given the significance of this, I again would request that this be continued to allow the regular counsel to appear for this. Otherwise, we have no choice but to do the best we can.
We will proceed, but as we go down the road, we may run into this issue, and at that time, we will make rulings upon what's admitted and what's not admitted.
Dr. Longley, I would recommend that the board chair acts as a hearing officer for the purposes of making pre-hearing rulings. At this point, we're having another request for a delay.
Good.
My suggestion would be to turn to the entire board to make that ruling.
And that's appropriate. So when this was brought to me 2 days ago,
hang on. There are two requests then. I think we should handle them one at a time. Can we do
2
the
days
first one
ago,
and then?
I ruled that.
Well, wait. I thought the first request was over just sticking to minimum mandatory penalties.
It was, yes.
So can we have a ruling on that before we proceed to whether to delay or not?
Okay, to back up, I had asked counsel for her recommendation, and so we can, it's appropriate now that we have a discussion on that. Or is there any issue that with any board members for a ruling to for the discussion only to focus on the MMPs and not on other discretionary issues that might be brought before the board?
Chair Longley,
Yes.
before the board actually discusses this, I would also add that there might be some facts that overlap, both this particular hearing and some issues that relate to discretionary penalties. So I think that before wholesale ruling on, before even hearing the evidence, I would recommend that the board hear what comes up and then make a note of it if it does arise during the hearing.
But I think from what I'm hearing is that we need a ruling from this board as to whether or not we want to hear anything past what pertains to the MMPs.
Well, I think that the way the matter's been agendized, we have a legal limitation that we can't go beyond
That's
that
right.
anyways. So,
I think you're correct. I mean, what we are going to hear today, and the scope of the hearing today, is the mandatory minimum penalties. I think the board can ratify that scope here right now. There may be evidence introduced that is relevant to the MMPs that could also be relevant to the discussion of a discretionary action in the future. We would not be within our right to exclude that type of evidence, but I think it's worthwhile for the board to ratify that the scope of the hearing today is the MMPs, and the evidentiary standard is materials and evidence that are relevant to the discussion of those mandatory minimum penalties. If there is evidence introduced by the discharger that is specifically and only relevant to the consideration of a discretionary penalty, we could hear an evidentiary objection from the board's prosecution team, at which point the board could rule on it. But I think at this stage, it would be worthwhile making a ruling to the effect that the scope of the hearing is limited to the MMPs and materials relevant to the MMPs.
So, to repeat what Patrick just said, I am asking for consensus on a ruling to limit testimony to the MMPs and those materials which are relevant to those MMPs.
And Your Honor, if I just may say, we
Just
stipulate
a
to
moment,
that.
I'm talking to my board. Is there any?
Yeah, I read everything, and it was about MMPs, so I'm prepared for MMPs
So,
only.
with that understanding, this board so rules that evidence will be so constrained. Now, the second item was that you brought up is you would like a extension of this hearing to this hearing to be postponed to a later date, and the date that was originally mentioned in the original correspondence was 90 days from now. So the decision that a couple of days ago was to have the hearing today, but the council for 16-1 has requested again that it be delayed, and so once again the ruling today will be from the board, not from any one member of the board. Do I have any discussion?
So I'd like to know from council, what risk the board might have on proceeding with the hearing today if council is making the representation that they haven't had time to prepare, and what the prejudice would be to continue it.
So the main risk would be whether or not there's adequate notice. But I will back up a little bit and highlight for the board that a request was made in October to delay the hearing, and at that point, after consulting with the board chair, the advisory team denied that particular request and kept it on the calendar for today. And then yesterday morning, another request was made, and this time the reason given was that counsel for the discharger had only recently been retained. Late yesterday evening, again, in consultation with the board chair, the advisory team denied that particular request.
Did the council from October, is it same council that is here today?
My understanding is that counsel was not retained in October.
It's hard to, I'm just one of the board members, but, I know it's a different standard. I know civilly in Superior Court, it's really prejudicial to go forward with the hearing if council hasn't had enough time to prepare. At some point, though, if the hearing has been calendared for a long time and the court, thinks that it is for purposes of delay only or a strategy, then the court doesn't have to be bound by what might otherwise be a fairness issue. So, this is a hard thing for me.
You brought up something that, particularly in the most recent request, was the fact that this had been on the calendar for a period of time. And at least I felt it was reasonable that they should have been able to retain counsel during that period of time.
I think we need to move forward on this, and we certainly don't want anybody setting a precedent that, let's just not hire counsel and we'll get it delayed. So I think there's been adequate time, and this is a very limited discussion about mandatory minimum penalties, and we aren't a court per se, although we serve a quasi-judicial function.
Well, with that said, is there further comment?
I think we ought to proceed.
Yeah,
So what I hear is consensus that we proceed with this issue?
Well, I don't know if it's consensus. I don't know that I agree, but I think that the majority of the board is in favor of
I'll
making the ruling.
paraphrase you, a majority of the board. agrees that we should proceed with this issue, and we will. Thank you.
If we could get that determination made through a roll call vote.
You want it through a roll call? Okay. Call the roll.
Ms. Brower?
Yes.
And by the way, before you go, the roll call is that we will proceed with this hearing. So go ahead and call the roll.
Ms. Brower?
Yes.
Ms. Ramirez?
No.
Mr. Costantino? Dr. Markham?
Yes.
Mr. Schneider? Ms. Kadara? Dr. Longley?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you. So we will proceed. Are there any other procedural issues? Hearing no more, we will proceed with the prosecution testimony. That call's for me. Also, they're not as conspicuous as eating a donut.
Good morning, Dr. Longley and members of the board. My name is Carrie Holmes, and I'm the Senior Engineer of the NPDES and Stormwater Compliance and Enforcement Unit here in the Rancho Cordova office, and I have taken the oath. We're here today to ask the board to adopt an administrative civil liability order against the original 16-1 mine for mandatory minimum penalties for violations of its NPDES permit. Before we discuss the details of the order, I want to give you a brief overview of how mandatory minimum penalties, or MMPs, are assessed. Then I will turn it over to Ida Soltani, who will discuss the history and current mining operations of 16-1 mine and their regulatory history with the board. Then I will wrap up with the regional board's history of enforcement with this discharger and the details of the proposed order. In 2000, the legislature enacted a mandatory minimum penalty structure from violations of NPDES permits. Water Code Section 13385 requires the assessment of MMPs for serious violations. Serious violations occur when dischargers exceed effluent limitations in their permit. There is no latitude on this penalty. The legislature has determined that violations of this nature be assessed a minimum penalty of $3,000 per violation. MMPs are the minimum required penalty that the board must impose for serious violations. Alternatively, the board may include a discretionary penalty for a total of up to $10,000 per violation. Unlike with discretionary penalties, we do not go through the enforcement policy's penalty methodology, which includes the ability to pay when assessing MMPs. The order we're asking you to adopt is only for MMPs and doesn't include discretionary penalties. The Water Code does allow for protection from MMPs in certain circumstances. When a permit is adopted that contains effluent limits which the discharger cannot immediately comply with, the board may choose to adopt a TSO or a CDO with a time schedule to achieve compliance. The discharger is given interim effluent limits in the order, allowing them time to comply with the limits in the permit. If the discharger exceeds the interim effluent limits in the TSO or CDO, MMP protection is lost for that reporting period. Now I'll turn it over to Ida to discuss the history of the mine, current mining operations, and the regional board's regulatory history of the mine.
Good morning, Dr. Longley and members of the board. My name is Ida Soltani, and I am the engineer for the NPDES and Stormwater Compliance Enforcement Unit here in the Rancho Cordova office, and I have taken the oath. 16-1 Mine is located in Allegheny, California, a small community in Sierra County. The western slope of the Sierra Nevada Mountains is also known as Gold Country or Mother Lode Country. This historic area is famous for mineral deposits and gold mines. Currently, the discharger collects loose rock that has been blasted from the working surface of the mine. Specimen gold is sold as is, and the rest is milled by hand. The groundwater and rainwater percolate through the mine waste, and as the water migrates through the waste, it picks up soluble minerals that are carried into Kanawha Creek with runoff. This runoff has a high mineral content that, left untreated, will impact water quality. Although the discharger is planning to install a permanent passive treatment system at the portal prior to discharge to the creek, there is currently no treatment or control for the mine's wastewater. The mine discharges wastewater via the 21 portal to Kanawha Creek, tributary to Yuba River, Feather River, and Sacramento River, all water of the United States. Since there are no beneficial uses designated for Kanawha Creek, the tributary beneficial uses will apply. Multiple beneficial uses are applicable to the Yuba River, such as cold freshwater habitat, which is intended to protect aquatic life. In order to protect the beneficial uses, the Regional Water Board issues waste discharge requirements, which we'll refer to as WDRs, or the permit throughout the remainder of the presentation. 16:1's permit contains limitation so that runoff from mining activities does not degrade water quality. Now I will tell a bit about the mine's regulatory history with the Regional Board. The previous WDRs were adopted in 2002, and a CDO was adopted as well to allow the discharger time to comply. Their current WDRs were adopted in February 2015. The effluent limits are based on analytical data collected by board staff. During the permitting process, the discharger demonstrated that it would not be able to comply with the effluent limits in the 2015 WDRs, and therefore the board also adopted a time schedule order. The purpose of the TSO is to allow time for the discharger to develop a control or treatment option that will ultimately result in compliance with the effluent limits in the WDRs. The TSO requires a treatment or control to be installed by April 2020. In addition, the TSO contains interim effluent limits for multiple constituents. As Carrie mentioned earlier, if the discharger complies with these interim limits, then it is protected from MMPs. However, if the discharger exceeds the interim effluent limits in the TSO, it loses protection for that constituent during that reporting period and is therefore subject to MMPs. I'll now turn it back to Carrie, who will provide the remainder of the presentation.
The discharger has a long history of non-compliance with the Water Board. The discharger failed to submit its monitoring reports from February 2006.
Carrie?
Yeah.
Yeah, you do.
Come up to the microphone, please.
I'm sorry, but since the board has ruled that this is being limited to non-discretionary enforcement, then I don't understand what the relevance would be of any past enforcement issues. I'm sorry. Is this better? Okay. Since the board has ruled that this is limited to the MMPs, then I object to any discussion of past history because it's not relevant to the MMPs.
Council? No, we're talking to council.
I would actually suggest that the prosecution team be allowed to comment.
Okay. You're going to turn your mic on.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. This is different than the objection that we made at the start of this hearing. This is information related to past violations, so there is no concern about the board being prejudiced or anything like that. All of this is information that is part of the public record from the past, is only provided to provide context to the board about the history.
Well, how would you respond to the objection that it's prejudicial and not relevant to the issue that's before us today?
I don't think it's prejudicial, but it could potentially not be relevant, and if you want to exclude it, you can. I don't think it will have any impact including it or not including it on the outcome of this case.
Counsel.
I would actually recommend excluding this particular sort of information and limiting the discussion today to the alleged MMP violations.
Very good. So ordered. With concurrence of the board?
I concur.
Yes.
Good.
And we will have this slide stricken from the administrative record when it's.
So for the record, we are skipping slides 14, 15, and 16 and moving directly to 17 based on the ruling.
So now I will talk about the current enforcement, current effluent limit violations associated with the proposed order. As I mentioned, this order only addresses MMPs for violations of effluent limits. This table shows the measured results reported by the discharger, along with the WDRs and TSO limits. We issued a complaint in September for these violations, which occurred during 2015 and 2016. The first violation for total suspended solids collected on December 17, 2015, was reported as 41 milligrams per liter, which exceeded the WDR's daily maximum limit of 30 milligrams per liter. However, this TSS exceedance does not result in MMPs because it is not a serious violation and is not otherwise subject to MMPs. Because only one sample was taken during the month, the measured value collected on December 17th is used to determine compliance with the monthly average limit. This monthly limit violation is considered serious and is subject to MMPs. You'll note that there is no TSO interim limit for TSS. In addition, there are 6 metals which exceeded the interim limits in the TSO: antimony, arsenic, cadmium, copper, iron, and nickel. As you can see, the discharger lost MMP protection for these metals because the interim limits were exceeded. Therefore, the permit's limits apply for these metals. In summary, a total of 11 MMP violations occurred, which amount to a $33,000 penalty, which is proposed by this order. The discharger did not submit evidence in this matter. The only potential issue the prosecution team is aware of is regarding the fourth quarter 2015 sample results. On March 1st, 2016, the discharger sent staff a letter stating that the sample results for this quarter were high due to the pumps being shut off during effluent sampling. As a result, the discharger contends it was difficult to get a sample without stirring up bottom sediment. The discharger requested the regional board staff's suggestion on how to mitigate the situation. Staff suggested obtaining future samples while the pumps are on to avoid collecting samples that may be considered high in TSS. There are limited reasons for board staff to dismiss samples that result in violations. In this case, board staff determined the sample results were consistent with other discharge sampling results, so they were used to determine compliance. In summary, the discharger exceeded the effluent limits in the 2015 WDRs for multiple constituents. Although the TSO contains interim limits for the metals, MMP protection was lost. The Water Code requires assessment of MMPs in the amount of $3,000 per serious violation. In this case, there were 11 serious violations, resulting in a total penalty of $33,000. The prosecution team recommends that the board adopt an administrative civil liability order in the amount of $33,000 as proposed. This ends our presentation. I'd like to enter this presentation, with some slides excluded, into the record. We'll also enter the prosecution team's evidence submitted into the record, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you for your testimony. Questions?
Yeah, I got a question. Can someone tell me how you collect the sample?
So samples, first of all, are collected by the discharger, so they do their own monitoring and reporting. They can either collect the sample themselves or contract out for a professional to do it. In this case, the regional board requires grab samples. I'm not sure if they use what's standard is basically a pole with a small sample container on the end, and they just dip it in the water. In this case, it's where the discharger flows into the creek out of the tunnel.
So can I ask whether, it seems like Kelly? Carrie doesn't have personal information as to how the sample is collected, and I don't know if it's speculation or whether that question is better asked of the next party.
Well, that's a question that may probably best be asked, as you were pointing out, by the discharger.
And
So if that would be all right with you? Good.
With respect to the evidence in the file and the NPDES permit, she's specifying how based on her knowledge, how the permit specifies that those samples would be collected. So personal knowledge would not necessarily be required.
Right, but she has some basis for her testimony. And
the permits are in the administrative evidence that's been submitted.
Any further questions?
I actually do have one question for the enforcement team. Regarding violation 7, it relies on Exhibit 38, which is the 2016 third quarter SMR. And this would be for a violation of antimony, and the version of Exhibit 38 that I have has that section crossed out. So if the enforcement team could address how this particular SMR was used to rely upon for the violation, that would be great.
I think we'll need just a minute to pull that up. You said Exhibit 38, correct?
That's correct.
So the dischargers are supposed to self-report the monitoring results. In this case, we asked the discharger to provide the actual laboratory results, and I'm not sure who crossed out the results like this, but typically if it were from a laboratory that had some kind of a QA/QC issue or a method issue where they didn't think the results were appropriate to be used, there would be some information provided, such as a cover letter or something of that nature. So when the discharger provided these results to us, it came in this format with part of the table with a line through it.
And so you did use these numbers to
Yes,
find that there's a violation?
we use the numbers to determine compliance, because if we don't have any supporting information to tell us why the results are not valid, then typically our practice is to use them.
Thank you.
Any further questions? Thank you. We're ready for testimony by the discharger, 16-1 Mine. No crosses later.
sorry. May I ask a point of clarification on the procedure?
You need to get your mic right in front of you. And
Sorry.
you asked for a point of clarification on the procedure. We'll go to testimony now. Following testimony will be cross-examination,
Okay.
as I read off earlier.
That's what I thought. So when the board asked for questions, it wasn't asking for our questions at this
No,
point?
no.
I just want to be clear. I'm sorry.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Michael Meister Miller. I am president of Original 16-to-1 Mine. Original 16-to-1 Mine is a corporation formed in San Francisco in 1911. It is the oldest mining corporation in North America. It's been in existence for 106 years. So this is the same company I work for. I'm a director and a president. I became director in 1977, and I became president in 1983, and I've held that position since then. I think a little history. First of all, I didn't expect to be addressing you today, nor did I expect Klaus to be here today with me. I want to put one statement of possibility right now. The operator, meaning my company, had no strategy to not have an attorney. There's no one that wants to get this more settled than I do. And it's been going on way too long. I think you know, or the staff certainly knows, that a gentleman named Rob Campbell, who is well qualified, took over the responsibility and had some meetings with the staff and with me down in here at this building. Rob is well qualified, and he got caught up in the Oroville Dam spillway. So what?
I'm going to object. I believe that Mr. Miller is about to get into the realm of what I was describing earlier, of discussing statements and evidence that are relevant to the discretionary action. I believe that Mr. Campbell was not retained and did not have anything to do with the MMPs.
Sir, she's wrong.
Counsel?
It's not really clear right now to me where this
Nor
is
is it clear to me. I don't know about other board members.
I guess it sounds like background. It doesn't really feel relevant. It seems more like an explanation as to why your counsel couldn't be here. And as I understand it, we're here to discuss whether or not the samplings that are used for the MMP violations are valid or invalid. And so I would expect that the testimony be centered around that. And I appreciate the background, but I tend to agree with prosecution that I don't know if this is relevant.
Well, you know, I'm trying to make a record, just like you are, because it is relevant. And we've been before you before, and we've
So
heard
can you
these different
explain how
things.
it's going to be relevant to the sampling?
I want to. I think that our company has not been treated fairly, and I think that you've heard things that are going to cloud your judgment today. When you can't strike it out when you hear these remarks, that once you can take them out of the record, but they've been stated. And I wrote a letter to December 7th, mailed it to Kaylin Ellison and a bunch of other ones, and made a comment on some of these things. And what I thought was going to happen happened, and I was taking opposition to that then, and I think it's a lingering situation that really needs to be brought out into the open.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
I mean, I think that what I would probably ask is if you can make an offer of proof, which means can you explain how the testimony you're giving is relevant to whether or not the samples that are taken are valid or not valid.
I
So I
can-
don't know whether or not unless your lawyer was there doing the sampling,
No.
I don't know that history is really relevant.
I was doing the sampling. What's relevant is I'm not prepared, and nor is Klaus prepared. Why is the reason we asked for a continuance? It wasn't any strategy. We lost our experts.
The board has ruled. The board has ruled on the continuance matter.
I
So
understand.
that's not relevant
The
to
board
the
has
discussion
ruled,
at hand.
And the issue is with the MMPs, and the record's pretty clear insofar as I look at those numbers that were presented.
So
So is there something wrong with those numbers?
So Chair Longley, can I recommend that we sustain the objection from the prosecution team and ask the defense to move on?
You've heard Board Member Ramirez recommend that the prosecution team's objection be sustained. Do I hear any comments, other comments from the board? I'm ready to rule in favor.
I agree.
I so rule.
Okay.
So direct your testimony to the MMPs themselves.
The MMPs are arbitrary, capricious. They have no effect. There's been statements made that there's been misstatements made about the beneficial use of Kanaka Creek. Kanaka Creek is an intermittent stream. It dries up. It's not navigable, but that'll be handled in the Supreme Court soon. But the other points are there's no the charge of serious is the issue here. First of all, you don't know that we took significant steps in 1998. This is what I've been directed by my board to bring up today, because we don't have the people here that were hired to come. I could not control that. So we stopped our mill. We're talking about a very, very small amount. You're talking about a $33,000 mandatory minimum payments, when I know that other places that have had these charges against them have been dropped or changed in the state. You're being presented as I saw you
sir,
in February.
that's hearsay at this point.
Okay.
Unless you can present that as evidence.
Well, we're just, the basic that I can only do today is to try to make a record. And I want to get truth and honesty and facts. Just think of this. This is a small amount that I took the sample. I'll tell you exactly how I took the sample, and we've been sampling this creek since the 1980s. And the proof up there that you were given was something that started in 2000. We have reports that show that the only effect of the changes in here are basically with the climates, when it's winter and water and what's going down. We don't add anything, we don't subtract anything to this discharge, which is a tunnel that was built in 1865. So this was, now our company didn't form until 1911, but it acquired this property. And by the way, there is a beneficial use downstream that's been in existence forever, and is as a dilution factor for mining. And we're not in the mother lode, we're in the northern mines. Every mining district, every place in a district has its own unique deposit situation, languages, and it has the right to do business. What is going on here is a taking of our rights to do business. The people that I employ are threatened. We were the largest private employer in Sierra County at one time, a few years ago. We have 4 right now, and you're being presented a picture that is not true, and there is room.
Excuse me for interrupting. What's not true? Is there issues with the data that was presented? Because that data speaks for itself.
Yes, there are. Cramner Labs has had a difficult time. They've worked with the state trying to get parts per billion through the testing system. Cramner Labs, we've been dealing with them for a long time. They've admitted that they have some issues. I'm asking for something from you that's going to be, I hope, easy to understand, common sense and reality. And that's why one of the things that is most important to me the last time I saw you was come up and take a look. You're being presented like this is a horrible situation. There's no damage. Kanaka Creek is wonderful. We have a great fish population. The aquatic insects are fantastic. There's no evidence of a pH factor. You can drink the water out of there. It has a little more natural minerals because it's coming through one of the richest gold places in probably the world, quite frankly, and you know that. You're from Grass Valley. And we're so small. And to think that the natural water is going to come here and you want to put $33,000 and sanction that for 11 violations of what's serious, when there's no serious, and you've been misled about the beneficial use and the whole downstream stuff. So no, I'm Rob and the other guys here, they do this for a living. I don't. I just run the company. I take the samples. I know how to take the samples. If I was a dishonest person, I'd water them down. I bring them in because there's nothing wrong. We need truth. So antimony is something that's new.
Excuse me, sir, I'm going to interrupt your
Sure.
testimony. You talked about we're being misled on beneficial uses. I'm going to turn to our advisory team. We were given some information on beneficial uses of this stream. Is what's stated correct, or are there issues with what was presented to us insofar as beneficial uses are concerned?
Dilution for gold mining is not a beneficial use recognized in our basin plan. The basin plan the arguments stated by the board's prosecution team are, to my knowledge, correct about how the basin plan characterizes the beneficial uses in this area.
Thank you.
The beneficial uses, I'm sorry, are vested rights. We're getting more and more information about vested rights. They have been there, and I don't know what we're going to do about this, but we have a naturally occurring situation when it rains.
You state vested rights. Counsel, what is this? Can you advise on vested rights insofar as beneficial uses are concerned?
Vested rights do not have a bearing on beneficial uses.
Thank you.
There's nobody drinking that water. We're being asked to break water to a drinking water standard and then dumping it into a 305C polluted creek. It's not polluted by dangerous things. It's got naturally occurring elements in it. These are naturally occurring elements. The arbitrary levels that have been set here are less than what some of these elements are used for cancer research. There's another issue that should be brought up by all the environmental people who don't want to put thing into a creek. We're taking something out that's been in there for millions of years. Where do we have a chance to try to bring some justice to this particular situation? So, and I saw all of you in Fresno, and I wanted to get the tape on that because I think 4 or 5 of you said this is one of the hardest things we have to do. We have to take something like this. Isn't there something we could do? Each one of you testified to that. I have no other. I'm going to put Klaus back up.
Excuse me. I'm going to object and ask that that be striked. If the prosecution team is not allowed to refer to previous enforcement actions, the discharger should be held to the same standard.
I'll sustain that objection.
I'm done. Thank you. We'll have some questions ourselves.
Mr.
So
Miller,
we'll strike
time
that
is
from the
running out,
record.
isn't
Can I ask you a question?
You can ask me anything.
I was going to ask the prosecution the same question, but I missed my opportunity, and I can ask them again. What is your understanding of the word serious?
That's what I'm going to ask them to define.
Oh, okay.
That's what I said right here. What is the full definition of serious? We are the most regulated business probably in the United States. I deal with a lot of federal people. They have a lot of things that go on. We have a wonderful safety record. That was here. What is the full definition of serious? How did you determine the evidence? Where's the evidence to bring to our attention about this is serious? It's ridiculous. What do they want to?
You'll certainly be able to ask that question. My question to you was, do you know what their definition is?
No, that's why I'm asking the question. But
Sir,
I know what Kanaka Creek is like.
Sir, why didn't you bring the company that does the analysis here with you today so that they could speak to whether or not these results are accurate or not?
Somebody in this department probably knows that already because they've been dealing with the state trying to get this stuff. I didn't expect to be here testifying.
Okay, well, that's separate.
And
That's separate.
I started the process to try to get a continuance, not as a strategy, but I knew I am not qualified.
I understand.
I'm
So
really not.
did you take any steps to bring in the analysis contractors in with you today?
I have all the letters. I have the letters. No, I do not have anything.
Okay, thank you.
I put my whole chronology down of when we met, what we did, and how I was trying to see what was going to go on here, knowing the situation with Oroville, knowing the other situations, and that's why we asked for a continuance.
I understand.
I think you would have really enjoyed having these people, these men come here and talk with you. And I know it would have been a heck of a lot better for me.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
May I have a second with Mr. Miller just before he concludes on behalf of the company? I'm sorry, I'm not super familiar with the procedure.
So
here,
certainly,
I'm
and,
asking.
and I will, how much time do you need?
Could I have a minute or two?
He will have a chance to make closing remarks.
Right. I want to make sure that he has the evidence and my client.
Tell us why
he's going to be. My
Okay.
client.
Yeah, just go ahead and confer with your client. And
We'll stand in place.
Okay, all right, thanks.
We'll take a short recess. Till 1:15. Yeah, I know. back in session. Yes, sir?
First of all, I'd like to apologize. I'm obviously pretty passionate about my job and what we're doing, so forgive me. And I'll try to get right to the point and tell you what I think is important. We had something set in April 17th of 2015. We were given from till April 16th, 2020 to figure out this new kind of testing. I took the test. I've been trained in taking the test. I took the water samples downstream, upstream, and from the discharge. It was exceedingly high. It was surprisingly high because even the geologists didn't know where this came from. So I think I mentioned it might have been the paint that we're required to use that has antimony in it. I went to the lab, and the Cramner Labs are the ones that told me that there's some issues with their testing equipment. We did a subsequent test later, which I think the water staff, has, and it was much lower. So it looked to me, I mean, today again, it's like one test. One of the times we're doing this, if I'm wrong, but it looks like one test is carrying an awful lot of weight in something that we weren't even aware was a problem. This, first of all of this is very serious for us, and if we're trying to get help from the staff on something that's new and it's out there, and getting into these fights or arguments, or it's a losing thing for us. I can tell you right now, in many ways than one. So I think that I don't know what more I can say. There's something unusual that happened. There's not a pattern of degradation to the environment, or there's no pattern here. There's one test. And I would hope you would all take that into consideration as you determine how we're all going to go forward.
So you've been focusing on antimony, and I presume, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you're not contesting the arsenic, cadmium, iron, nickel, or copper results. I will contest based something's wrong. Something is wrong with the process right now, and I'm not qualified to pinpoint what it is. So, I would make the recommendation, a suggestion that there's an issue here with all of the elements. These are naturally occurring elements. There's nothing that we've added. We don't use mercury. We don't do anything like that. So I can't explain it, and I'm under oath, so I've talked with 2 geologists that couldn't explain it. And it's something very important that we want to get a grip on. So you work the mine, and you have water flowing out of that mine, and does that water flow through any material that results from rock being crushed, pulverized, or whatever as part of the mining process?
Not from our mining process, but if it happened from something in the past, that's possible. There's one other thing. This is the type of discussion that I'd really like to have, because the Allegheny Water District dug some wells a few months ago. We got a state grant for our water system up there, and they hit arsenic at 103 feet, and we've got what's called the Old Dead River, which was a auriferous river that went north and south through California. And behind for example, our discharge point, which is just free-flowing gravity coming through the mountain, which is 5,000 feet elevation behind us, comes out at some springs where it hits bedrock, trickles down into the mine, and it just comes out the hole in the ground that was put there in 1865. And we don't, that's why I wanted to mention the biggest thing we could do to mitigate any type of harm or alleged harm was to stop the milling operation. We used to mill 10 tons an hour. We ceased that because we just couldn't afford to, we just couldn't afford the risk. So I don't, I'm qualified to take samples. I'm qualified to take them down to the lab. We've used Cramner. Cramner's had an issue. And we've got an event that occurred that now threatens our small operation with the potential of $33,000.
Are there any questions for Mr. Miller?
So I have a question, and maybe I'm missing this, but so you got a TSO in 2015, early in 2015, right? Did you know what the limits were when you got that, and did you think you would meet the standard 6 months later?
No, sir. In fact, I've tried to work with not the prosecution team, but with the solution team, and tried to figure out how these things were there and get. I sat in here one time and was ready to leave before you got a chance to hear me, and we've been trying to get this thing solved, and I need help. I don't need animosity. I don't need it in my life. Our people don't need it. We're not the bad guys. We have free milling gold, and there's a lot of things going on. So no, I didn't feel comfortable with that, and I think we all as a group should look into this, how these things were established. I mean, when my research told me that arsenic is a accepted treatment for cancer, and I called the hospitals. I mean, I don't know.
Well, there are things used in medical science for treatment at therapeutic levels which are much greater than you'll find them in accepted in water supplies. But you know, the patient is taking a risk from that, but the much greater risk is the cancer itself. That's can be said for other
Sure.
materials also.
Yeah.
I have a question for you.
Sure.
You have mentioned that the lab you used, there was an issue with it. Why wouldn't you have your water tested somewhere else?
I tried it. Well, there's a real practical reason. There's time, but I've got to exactly get the time on the form that is gathered, and it has to get to the lab in a certain time, because while nobody knows why we're doing it, we're doing dissolved oxygen too, and so I can't drive it up to Chico. I did that one time in Chico. Cramner, we've been using them a long time, and they've seemed to be really aware of the problems, and they were honest with me, and I'm honest with them. So we've had a long time relationship. They're right in Grass Valley.
Okay. Any further questions, comments? Do you have any further comments?
I came into this room and I was thrilled. I don't know if the ladies here, Miss Wayborn, but I was so thrilled to hear that conversation, because I live in the Tahoe National Forest, and we've been trying to get recognition for clearing the understory. We know that, I mean, we live it. I've lived there 40 years. Our place is beautiful. Our creeks are good. Our trees are healthy. We're in I think it's 4A grade timber zone. Sierra Pacific is the largest landowner, and I went up to her afterwards and said, "This is wonderful. We're getting somebody to actually hear what we've been saying, some of us up there for years, of trying to be able to clear understory, have proper management, and our company has 500 acres of timberland." and we manage it well. And so thank you, and I appreciated all of your comments, and I've made a contact with her, and I'm going to try to find out more about what she's doing, because we need to do it in the Tahoe National Forest as well. So I did have a couple of questions, but that can wait, I think, right? I don't know.
You'll have your opportunity for
okay,
that.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's time now for, get back, I don't want to deviate from the procedure. It's time for cross-examination of the prosecution team. Do you wish to cross-examine the prosecution team?
Yes, Your Honor. Yes, Your Honor.
Chairman.
Chairman, I'm
Chairman.
sorry. So, I'm not trying to question the court's ruling on the continuance, but I'm just explaining that I don't even have a copy of the complete complaint here because I just got this last night. So we're trying to abide with the court's ruling, the board's ruling to the best of our ability here.
Thank you. Proceed.
So the question I have is, the prosecution mentioned that they were informed that there was an issue with the sampling on the for the results that showed abnormally high levels here, and that they decided for some reasons that they were going to use the samples despite that that concern, without explaining what it was, what considerations they used in determining whether to go ahead and give full weight to those samples, despite the operator, Mr. Miller, telling them that there were problems with those samples and with the lab. I'd like to understand what their reasons were for disregarding the information that the mine provided them and going ahead and using those samples as the basis for their violations.
So there are very limited reasons for board staff to not use data provided by the discharger. Typically, we would get a report that had information along the lines of, as I mentioned, a QA/QC error or a method issue. In this case, we were told that there was an operational change at the facility that may have increased the suspended solids. A couple of things. One, board staff is not aware, based on the reports provided by Mr. Miller, whether the pumps are typically running when they've sampled in the past, or if they've been off in the past. So it's not a requirement of the permit. So we were never informed, which samples we would have to look at and deem, satisfactory or not. The second thing is, what we did, board staff looked at the results of that one sampling event, and we compared it to approximately 3 or 4 years of data of other sampling events where he didn't mention the pumps were off. And the sample results were very consistent. There was not a lot of variation in the data collected from that one, fourth quarter 2015 result compared to the other data that we had. So we thought it was very representative of their discharge.
But your complaint, I only have here a complaint number R5 2016-0511, which relates to antimony. And in it, you say this is not an issue of a chronic violations.
I'm going to object. I believe that is the complaint from 2016, which was the previous enforcement action that opposing counsel had objected to the prosecution team mentioning earlier.
Sustain.
Okay. When the do you concede that Mr. Miller told you that there was a problem with the sampling operation on the ones that led to this particular violation?
The information he provided didn't say there was a problem. He said that the pumps were off. That's the information that he provided to us.
Well, didn't he offer that as an explanation for why the results were higher for this sampling event than for others?
Yes, he offered that as his analysis.
And I just have a clarifying question. Is that is that is your question and then your answer as to all the samples, or is it one sample in particular?
To be honest, I don't know because I'm responding to what I'm hearing here
Okay, and
without
so
having the backup.
When you answered the question, did you intend to speak as to all the samples that are alleged in the violation today?
No,
Or just
we're
one?
only talking about the fourth quarter
15.
15. Yes.
Is that the only event that's the basis for the violations here today?
No, it is not.
Okay, do you have a summary of of what they are?
Yes, it's fully outlined in the complaint.
Do you have a copy handy that I could look at quickly?
Yes, that's
Is that slide 18?
Yes, it is, and I can pull that up if you'd like.
Please pull it up.
So this table is a summary of all of the violations that were alleged in the complaint. And as you can see, there were 4 samples taken. They're required by their permit to monitor once per quarter.
Very good. So if you take your seat and allow Mr. Kolb to have access to the podium. Need to turn it on too.
Are these all of the alleged violations for 2015?
Not the entire year of 2015. This is for the fourth quarter 2015 and all 4 quarters of 2016.
Can I ask, are there samples that met the standard?
So every sample that was collected, there was a violation of at least one constituent. They didn't, each sample is analyzed for multiple constituents. So each sample had either one or multiple violations, but not every constituent was exceeded with each sample.
And just to refresh, between the fourth quarter in 15 and when the TSO was issued, how much time had passed? Roughly.
Well, according to what I have, the TSO was issued on April 17th, 2015. Is that correct?
Yes, it was issued on April 17th, 2015, so approximately 6 months or so.
And this was based on the new WDRs that were issued on February 5th, 2015, right?
Correct.
So there was a total of about 2 months that passed between the time the WRs were issued and the TSO was issued?
Correct.
And so the violations are starting almost immediately after the TSO was issued on a WDR that they're supposed to have until April 2020 to fully comply with, right?
So how it works is when we do provide a protection order, we have to use the data available to us to determine what a reasonable interim effluent limit will be. to give them protection. It's kind of like, this is how you're performing. Don't get any worse until you get better, you know, and comply with your permit. So at the time that the TSO was issued, there was not a lot of data that had been collected or reported by the discharger, which puts us in a difficult position to actually come up with a really good interim limit that they can meet. So we had limited data to determine the interim limit.
Well, and that's a problem for the mine also, right? I mean, they're getting hit with new requirements as of February 2015, some of which have never been identified as pollutants before, like antigen, at levels that they've never had to monitor before, correct?
So if I could interrupt, perhaps for council's benefit to focus some of the inquiries. The way this works is the board adopts waste discharge requirements. The requirements set water quality-based effluent limitations to protect beneficial uses in the receiving water body. If the board, in its discretion, gives a discharger time to comply, to install treatment methodologies or other mechanisms to comply with those water quality-based effluent limitations, the board can issue a time schedule order, which includes a higher limitation, essentially saying that beneficial uses won't be protected, but that's okay as long as you're making diligent process in making the improvements necessary to meet those permit limitations. What we're talking about here today with those numbers that you see up on the screen is that even those additional higher limits were exceeded by Mr. Miller and 16-to-1 mine after the time schedule order was issued. So the time schedule order was really issued to try and boost the limit, to give more latitude to the discharger while they're installing their treatment or control to get to that lower limit that was just established.
I understand that. My point is, and the questions that I'm asking here, is that many of these standards were adopted in February of 2015 for items that were never even identified as pollutants before, like antigen. And as
Sir,
I think you're referring to antimony?
Antimony, I believe. Yes.
What did I say?
Antigen.
Oh, I'm sorry. Different case. I apologize. There's another animal vaccine case I'm working on, and antigen is an issue, so I apologize. So antimony is a new item that was tested for, according to the one complaint that I have here. And as you just suggested, nobody had a lot of data on what was actually in the levels of water coming out of the mine at the time, or what the testing was for them. Is that correct?
I'm going to object. Enforcement staff is not part of the permitting staff in this case, so I don't think that it's appropriate for the enforcement staff to be commenting on this. Everything is in the record from the permits, and the permits speak for themselves on this matter.
Well, I'm just asking for clarification on, I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name. Carrie, what Carrie just said a minute ago.
You have an objection that has to be acted on, counsel.
Adam, do you have something?
I just want to say, just one as a point of clarification, the concern that the CDO was adopted sometime after the NPDES permit is true. It was adopted afterwards, but the NPDES permit became in effect one day before the CDO was adopted on April 16th. So the effective date of those limits and those requirements actually was the day before the CDO was adopted. I just want to
clarify. It's the TSO, not the CDO. TSO.
So can I ask counsel a question? I have a question, but I don't think now's the time to ask it because the defense is still in cross-examination.
We have an objection that I think we have to deal with, and the objection being that questions are being asked that the prosecution team states are more relevant to the permitting folks and not to the enforcement folks. And
I mean, my suggestion would be that the permits are in evidence to the extent that the prosecution team can answer as to their understanding of the permits that are being enforced in this action here today. Those responses would be relevant. If they exceed the scope of the witness's knowledge, then that should be so stipulated, and I think that can be understood.
That needs to be part of the record, in other words. So I don't sustain. Under those conditions, we'll proceed.
So, if I understand your question correctly, we're just talking about antimony in particular as a constituent?
Well, I think your previous answer was about the TSOs in general when they were adopted in April, and that you
Right.
didn't have a lot of information from the mine or from other sources of what was actually in the water flow and what was existing as of the date these new WDRs went into effect. Is that correct?
We did have sufficient information to provide interim effluent limits and give a protection order.
Didn't you tell me a minute ago that you were uncertain about what the levels were and that there wasn't a lot of data about what was actually there to start with?
I don't think that was my intent. So
Isn't the issue here a little bit that the witness wasn't involved in actually setting the limits? And she's talking about her understanding, but she wasn't, I mean, the prosecution team wasn't there at that time to have thorough knowledge about how the limits were set. Their job is to look at these are the limits and what's going on now, and should we be enforcing penalties? Is that correct?
And I think that Mr. Snyder, Board Member Snyder, has stated what your extent of knowledge was. Is that correct?
that's correct.
And to the extent that the request is a collateral attack on the TSO or the limits established in the time schedule order, the time to challenge that expired a long time ago.
Well, I understand that there's procedural obstacles in the way that the regulations have been adopted about challenging the validity of particular limits, but in addition to that, you're asking somebody to come up with testing methodologies to meet those limits in a very short period of time after they were adopted. And so the point of my questions is to the reliability and the ability of the operator to take accurate samples in such short order on items that have recently become an issue and that were never an issue before.
So just to clarify, antimony is a CTR constituent, a California Toxics Rule constituent. A tremendous amount of research has been in developing the testing methodologies for virtually all the CTR constituents, including antimony. That is discussed at length in the NPDES permit and frankly is the subject of a lot of regulatory scrutiny by both US EPA since, I guess, around 2001. So it wasn't that Dr. Miller would need to come up whole cloth with the testing methodology for antimony or that the labs would have to. That's all part of the traditional lab certification process. And again, I would suggest that the inquiry really be focused on whether there was some errors, some dispute as to what the numbers are up on the board today. I mean, that's really what the question is about here today.
Are you?
And just for, I mean, me as a board member, I will be looking at the state law with respect to mandatory minimum penalties. And I'll be looking at the beneficial uses that are defined by our basin plan. And we're somewhat constrained in the decisions that we can make on that. I don't think we can rule on the validity of a lab's data or not. That's not in our purview. And there's some concerns about that. I do hear that, but we have no way of judging that other than these are the lab numbers that we must use in a very constrained look at our purview in terms of minimum mandatory penalties.
Well, I don't want to cross into closing argument here. I guess I'll have an opportunity to address some of that then, but I guess I'll leave the questions, and I think there's probably enough here to make the closing statement. So
thank you.
Without more of a record for me to review, there's nothing more I can do at this point. So thank you for your time.
Thank you. At this point in time, call for a cross-examination of the original 16-1 mine by the prosecution team.
We do not have any questions for the discharger.
Very good. Then are there any comments by interested persons here? I don't have a card from anyone who hasn't spoken already, but is there somebody in the audience? Is there anyone in the audience who wishes to address this issue? Seeing none, then we'll go to a closing statement by original 16-1 mine.
Thank you, members of the board. I'll be brief, partly because I have no choice. But the issue here is that there were new requirements adopted in February 5, 2015, testing for elements that hadn't been tested before, that the mine wasn't familiar with the best procedures for sampling of, and they did their best to comply. On April 17th of 2015, the board issued its TSO, which was intended to provide protections to operators so that they can try to meet the new requirements. And the mine tried to do that, and they are still trying to do that, and those are the people that we had hoped to be able to bring and weren't able to. So they did their best to try to take samples in the meantime. Some of the sampling was imperfect. It was their attempt to try to comply. They didn't know if pumps on or off make a difference or not, how close to the bottom or not. They don't know what the sources of this are. The basic problem is that the water that's coming out of the 21 tunnel is coming out of a tunnel that was built in 1865 that doesn't go past any current mining activity. It's just a source, it's a source of water flowing from the top of the mountain into Kanaka Creek, along with 1,000 other such sources along Kanaka Creek. The whole area is mineral rich. That's why gold is there. That's why antimony is there. That's why arsenic is there. It's all in the ground. The water leaches some of that out, as the prosecution explained during their presentation. It leaches some of it out, it goes through the rock, and it comes out the bottom. So what we have here is now an effort to impose $33,000 in penalties based on changing samples here that are trying to hit a TSO that was adopted based on minimal information about what was actually coming out of the mine at the time and what the ability of the mine was to comply. And as this table shows, just in a quick review, I mean, sometimes they hit it, sometimes they exceeded it, sometimes they were under. But it's I would submit that under the circumstances here where they're trying to adjust a sampling technique and don't know specifically how the sample, taking the sample might adjust these very small quantities of trace elements in it, that there just isn't reliable evidence to impose these $33,000 in mandatory penalties here. And ultimately, it's the prosecution that bears the burden of proving that all of these levels were exceeded. And based on the information and the constraints that the mine was working under at the time, and the fact that they communicated that there were concerns about how the samples were taking and how the lab was being able to analyze them to meet these new targets, I submit that the evidence isn't there to justify the MMPs. Thank you.
Questions by board members? Thank you. Closing statement by prosecution team.
Dr. Longley and members of the board, I'm Andrew Altavogt, Assistant Executive Officer. I just wanted to address one thing, which is the fact that you know, we do have occasion when MMPs are issued that we receive reports from a lab, we receive other documentation that might, in certain cases, cause us to understand that there are questions with the data that we've received. In this case, all the way from the beginning, we haven't had any of that. If we had, we may have had some reason to look at these differently, but since we don't have any of that documentary evidence, and because these are MMPs, and we have very little flexibility in being able to dismiss them, what we need to do is go on the information that was submitted to us, and so that's what we have here. So we recommend that you adopt the MMPs as proposed.
Any questions?
Andrew, maybe this is a legal question, but can you answer the serious question? Not a serious question, but what is the team serious? Is there any discretionary aspect to that, or is it a percentage over the number, or how do you define serious?
So I don't have the exact definition. I think probably council would better define that, but it is defined in the water code.
So under the mandatory minimum penalty provisions, there are two types of violations that show up. The first is serious violations, and the second is chronic violations. The serious violation means, I'll just read it directly. A serious violation means any waste discharge that violates the effluent limitations contained in the applicable waste discharge requirements for Group 2 pollutant as specified in Appendix A to Section 123.45 of Title 40 of the Code of Federal Regulations by 20% or more, or for Group 1 pollutant as specified in Appendix A to Section 123.45 of Title 40 of the Code of Federal Regulations by 40% or more. So these are specific pollutants that are outlined in the federal regulations, and it's either an exceedance by 20 or 40%, depending on the type of pollutant.
Thank you.
Very good. Any further questions? If not,
I have a question.
So
I'm looking at the sample on September 30th. It's number 10. So nickel, is that a Schedule 1, Schedule 2? Because the exceedance is 153, and it looks like the maximum is 150. So was there a calculation there that showed that it was within the 10% or 20%?
And before you give an answer, I think I can go ahead and close the hearing. And when the hearing closed, discussion will be limited to board members and members of the advisory team. So if you could provide an answer to her.
So the way that I understand, so which violation was this again? It's number
10, dated 30 September for the parameter for nickel.
So the way that I understand that the prosecution team calculated the violations is that the exceedance is based on what is in the WDR and not the TSO. So here, the WDR limit for nickel is 21, and the measured result was 153, so the percent of exceedance is based off of 21.
I understand. Thank you.
We have no flexibility in reducing the penalty at all.
Unless you find any of these alleged violations as suspect, and you can, with sufficient evidence, remove them from the calculation. Dr. Langley, I do have a question for the prosecution, if I can ask them.
Go ahead. We'll allow.
And we'd reopen the hearing for that.
Reopen, exactly.
I'm sorry, I should have asked earlier, but Mr. Miller did make the prosecution team aware of the sampling, collection of the sample concerns, and the results as a result of that for some of those items for the fourth quarter of 2015, in which, because he didn't have a pump going, he actually pulled up some of the sediment in addition to just the water, which may alter the results of the sample. And I'd like to hear from the prosecution team on why they didn't call those samples into suspect.
Good question.
So I think I addressed this a little bit earlier, but there's a couple of reasons. The discharger didn't provide us with enough information for us to not consider the samples. He mentioned an observation, and typically when folks monitor and report back, they do include an observation as if there's one to note. The second factor is we had no idea whether they were sampling regularly with the pumps on or off. We didn't have that information for all of the other samples. So because they're not always running, and he hadn't made any statements to the fact that in the past they've always been on. And then the third thing, and I think the most important thing, is that this sample that was collected, that he saw some more suspended solids visually, the results, again, were very consistent with samples that were taken in the effluent over the last few years surrounding this sampling event. So to board staff, we didn't see that the sample results fluctuated or varied enough for board staff to consider calling the sample into question.
So I need to follow up with that. So here's my confusion. On one hand, we have enough data that we felt comfortable issuing a TSO at a level, and we felt like this was a sufficient data point because it matched previous data points, and yet it was only 6 months after we issued a TSO that we were significantly over the number, and we had testimony that there was no actions at the facility to change what the number was. So that, to me, that's worrisome, right? That we issued something that was in violation right away, especially something that was subject to MMPs. So I guess my question is, and the board can discuss that issue, but the question is, once this comes to your attention as a prosecutor, do you have the opportunity to talk to the permitting staff? Or is that at that point is the sort of the wall go up, and you're not allowed to figure out what the permitting history was? Is it just strictly a number?
So you're correct. We don't discuss the case or details with the permitting staff. However, the permit does contain quite a bit of information in the fact sheet. So it does spell out for us in our information to know what these limits were based on, how many samples were taken, what the maximum concentration detected was. So we just use the information available from the permit and the case file.
And were there higher maximums in the past? Or have they gotten worse?
I would have to look. I can't really speak to the whole entire history of monitoring. I can tell you that the way they come up with an interim limit is they take all of the data available to them, and they come up with kind of a factor of safety above the highest result that they have available to them.
Dr. Long, I think the advisory team could better advise the board on the permitting process.
Thank you. All right.
Thank you very much. We'll close the hearing again. Sir, the hearing's been closed. We could go around in circles all day. I'm not sure it's going to provide any additional information that's been beneficial to the board.
I don't think we should do that. I think we have enough information. Yes. But let's listen to our advisory board and go from there.
And I concur. So I appreciate comments from the executive officer and from council.
Well, I mean, I think we could discuss really, John, I think your concern is a valid one.
Does that relate to the decision we have to make?
It does. It doesn't relate to the decision that we have to make today. But in terms of providing context, I think the board could revisit the TSO limitations with the benefit of additional information to potentially raise those limits, recognizing that the interim limits set in a time schedule order largely lie within the board's discretion and are not intended to provide protection for beneficial uses. I mean, it really is a bridge between the current state of violation and the ultimate treatment system or whatever management practices need to be deployed to achieve compliance with either technology-based or water quality-based effluent limits, or water quality-based effluents, I should say. And so we should have an opportunity to revisit the ceiling provided by the time schedule order if consultation with the permitting staff, believes that a higher limit is appropriate. I think when they look at that, it's a consideration of where the end point is, what we're trying to set, and what we're trying to compel the discharger to do. In this case, install treatment to be in compliance with water quality-based objectives. But more to the point, I think we do try to set interim effluent limitations that are high enough. And I know the board has deliberated on this in the past, high enough so that they won't be an immediate state of noncompliance. It may be that we did not have enough data points to appropriately set that limit so that they will never be in compliance, but revisiting the time schedule order, as Board Member Schneider discussed, is beyond the scope of this particular hearing.
So, Executive Officer Creedon, your comments?
So all that Patrick said is true. I mean, in this particular case, because we did have very limited data to project out TSO limits, and it's based on statistics. And I think Adam has pointed out we've had at some point just 2 data points. The discharger is responsible for submitting that information, so we can only use what we have in the file to make the limits. So possibly these limits do need to be revisited, but it's up to the board's discretion on how they want to guide us. Right now, you have a limited selection options here. It's a mandatory minimum penalty unless the board can find that any of the data before you presented is questionable or should be discarded. They do meet the definition of serious violations, and the board must assess minimum mandatory penalties. You don't have any discretion in that regard. So I recommend that the board approve this ACL as proposed. I haven't heard anything to the contrary, and we will have Adam and his staff look at this data to see if the TSO needs to be revised or revisited and proposed back to the board at a later time.
And for the benefit of the record, the Adam that was referenced in Ms. Creedon's comments is Adam Lapitz, Assistant Executive Officer with the Regional Board.
So maybe I shouldn't ask this question, but if the numbers are revisited, what happens to this action?
Again, we wouldn't be revisiting the violations of the time schedule order, but raising the limits in a time schedule order that currently provides mandatory minimum penalty protection could potentially shield against future mandatory minimum penalties.
And if we did that, that's a whole nother hearing, and we'd have to have all the facts and bases, and I'd only support that if we were heading in the right direction, right? I mean, we're a long way off from compliance, and I'm not just going to vote to raise numbers so that someone's out of a possibility of non-compliance. But if we issue a TSO with a 5-year lead time and 5 months later we're not meeting it, I do think that's problematic.
And I would agree. I think the time schedule order could be issued by the executive officer or could be issued by the board after a hearing. And the board retains a large degree of discretion in how it issues the time schedule order and the type of protection it provides and the ceiling that's provided by the mandatory minimum penalty interim effluent limits that are set by the time schedule order. So certainly that could be something up for discussion. It has come before the board before that precise question of how it should exercise its discretion in setting interim effluent limitations, particularly when there is a question of what the ultimate compliance option and whether the discharger is making reasonable diligence towards achieving that. It's certainly not prejudging any hearing that the board may have with respect to modifying this particular time schedule order.
So, at this point, it's your pleasure. Do you have further discussion, or do we have a motion?
Excuse me. I commented before about my take, which was confirmed in the fact that we are bound by state law on mandatory penalties and the beneficial uses that are defined in our basin plan. And I've seen no evidence of the fact that that data isn't good data. And whether it is or it isn't, I don't know, but there's been no evidence to the point that it isn't. The other interesting thing in the data is just that things have gotten worse. Just looking at the antimony, it was 41.1 before, and now it's like 60. I hear what John's saying about TSOs and trying to set them, but the reality is we're also trying to get to the waste discharge requirement limits. And so my motion is to support staff on the $33,000.
So we have comments, but we have a motion, and is there a second?
Second that.
So Bob has moved, and Najee has seconded that we adopt the ACL order.
So, following up on Bob's point, again, I don't see why the data is bad. I mean, I don't know why we would throw it out. Our counsel has said only if it's suspect. I don't know if it is or not. I don't really like the whole mandatory minimum penalty process, and it really bothers me if we're throwing people into that process right away. So I don't know that I have much of a choice but to follow the bounds of what is laid out in front of me, but I can certainly express that being here today is not, the recommended course of action.
I have two comments. Number one is that we're talking about whether a certified lab's data is suspect. That could be asked of any data from any certified lab in this country. And this system works upon the fact that these labs are certified. They have to pass testing to keep their certification. So we have to trust that data, unless somebody can give us overwhelming evidence that data is not to be trusted, and I haven't seen that overwhelming evidence. There's also responsibility all along of the discharger to ensure that sampling methods are correct. If there are issues, those should be raised at the time. They need to be correct procedures, and certainly our staff are available. If it needs to be resampled, then it should be resampled if there is suspicion that the sample was taken improperly. And I don't see that was done either.
And,
yes.
And if I could, I know there's been some statements by the board members as to what the evidence and the standard of evidence that they're talking about with how they view these. With respect to administrative civil liability actions, the evidentiary standard is substantial evidence in light of the whole record before the board. It's not necessarily an overwhelming standard, but I understand that the board statements are to that standard is being met by the prosecution team.
Correct.
That's correct.
I want to add one more thing, because I completely agree with John about concerns over mandatory minimum penalties. And without some ability for a board on a vote with an overriding consideration to make a change, which I think the law should have, I think that we're stuck. So
that's right. Are there any further comments?
This is, this is hard in part because I think that the discharger, I think, did try to inform the board staff that he thought that the samples were not valid. I wish that I could have heard it from he was the sampling, but from the analytical lab. If he could have had somebody here, I think I could have been persuaded. And unfortunately, inexperience in knowing how having a pump on or off will affect a sample is not necessarily a justification for the exceedances. Now, I think that there might be an explanation, but I don't think that there's objective evidence that I can rely upon here. So I feel stuck as well. I appreciate the insight that John gave regarding whether or not the limits in this order are appropriate and whether they're the right limits. But I know that's something not before us right now. So that's an unfortunate thing, but I'm sympathetic, but I don't think that I've got sufficient evidence before me where I can disregard the objective evidence that was presented by the prosecution team. So, I intend to somewhat reluctantly support the motion on the floor.
Any further comments?
I'll just make a brief comment. The definition serious given to us by council, when the waste discharge exceeds 20 exceedances 20 or 40%, to me that is the situation that we're dealing with, along with what we're charged to do, and I don't see anywhere where there were efforts made to, going back to some of the stuff that the board member Ramirez has said, there were opportunities if you'd had staff, your professional support here to help address some of the concerns that you had, it would have made a difference. But I'm looking at the seriousness of this matter and the issue of water quality, and I'm inclined to not support this, to support our staff's recommendations.
Any further comments? Hearing none, call the roll.
A clarification for the record. Ms. Ramirez, was that a second to the motion, or?
I think Ms. Brar seconded the motion.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Brar
We didn't
seconded the
hear that.
motion,
Thank
that's
you.
correct.
Ms. Brar?
Yes.
Mrs. Ramirez? Yes. Mr. Costantino? Mr. Schneider? Dr. Markham?
No.
Ms. Kadara? Dr. Longley?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you. With that, we'll proceed to agenda item 20. This is the time and place for a hearing to consider a resolution adopting a climate change work plan for the Central Valley region. This hearing will be conducted in accordance with the notice of public hearing and the meeting procedures published with the meeting agenda. This time, evidence should be introduced on whether the proposed action should be taken. Following the staff presentation, interested persons may speak for 3 minutes each. A timer will be used. Please state your name, address, and affiliation before speaking. Does council have any legal issues to discuss at this time?
Not at this time.
We will now begin with the staff presentation. How long of a presentation is this?
Dr. Longley, over on the side, Andrew Altvogt. Sorry. I believe the presentation itself should be about 20, 25 minutes.
Okay. Make it as brief as possible with giving us all the information we need to know to make a decision.
Absolutely. We will.
I'll try my very best. Good morning, Dr. Longley and members of the board. I'm Jeff Rader. I'm a water resource control engineer in Rancho Cordova. Here to talk about the climate change work plan. So I'll talk briefly about just some background on anticipated climate change impacts, the work plan itself, the process we've gone through, and then I'll hand it off to Andrew, and he'll get into a few more of the details. So just very briefly on potential impacts in the Central Valley. This data comes from the Cal Adapt website, which we summarize a bit in the work plan. But as you'd expect, climate is expected to get warmer in the Central Valley. The 5 to 6 degree Fahrenheit increase in temperature, that's anticipated by the end of the century. And there's also an anticipated increase in heat wave days and also heat period. So basically just a lengthening of the warmest period of the year. And then also a anticipated increase in the burned area from wildfires by about 40 to 70%. So it's also expected that precipitation and snowpack patterns will change. Overall, a decrease in Sierra Nevada snowpack is anticipated as more precipitation falls as rain instead of snow. At the same time, it's expected that these extreme precipitation events will become more common. So these atmospheric rivers that dump an incredible amount of rain in a short period of time. But overall, the average winter rainfall is expected to decrease slightly. It's about 15 to 30% anticipated by mid-century, and that's from the Scripps Institute. And also a slight decrease in the number of wet years is expected. So this slide just at a high level goes over some state and regional board actions that are ongoing. So we're collaborating on climate change research. We're encouraging stakeholders and the public to participate as we develop these climate change considerations. We're introducing climate change actions into regulatory programs, developing an overall climate change adaptation strategy, and for Region 5, I think that's what the work plan represents. And then also identifying some specific programmatic requirements and increasing our coordination both within our agency and with other agencies. So here's the overall timeline of the process we've gone through. We had a stakeholder meeting all the way back in March where we presented our outline for the work plan and got some initial input. The initial draft of the work plan was released in May. And then presented to the board at a board workshop on June 1st. We had another stakeholder meeting on October 6th, and then released the proposed work plan on October 24th. We received several comments since then and made some updates to the proposed work plan. Based on those comments, we have a handout which summarizes all the late revisions in response to those comments. And we're hoping the work plan gets adopted today, and then moving forward, we will bring the work plan back to the board for revision and reconsideration every 5 years, and that is outlined in the resolution, that frequency for revisiting it. So this is the work plan outline, which I think most folks have seen before. 4 sections, an introduction. The second section, again, goes over the anticipated impacts at a high level and also reviews other statewide initiatives just to provide some broader context of how the work plan kind of fits into the big picture. Section 3 is a program-by-program review of Region 5 considerations for addressing climate change. And then Section 4 is the outline of major efforts, kind of proactive efforts that we have planned, and also timelines for those efforts. Did we lose some slides?
Yeah, evidently we have a older version of the presentation.
I thought you were just being efficient. I'm like, wow, we're done?
Well, there is more either way, but a slide or two didn't get put in this presentation. So I think we can proceed, but there may be 1 or 2 things I'll have to just bring up at the end.
That'd be fine. Thank you. And as Jeff hands it over to Andrew, Jeff, just want to thank you. I know you stepped up after this program has started, and Andrew was needing some help to get this thing across the finish line. So I really appreciate all that you did.
I'll certainly second that. Jeff was very instrumental in getting this done. So I just wanted to go through, well, first of all, just to mention, there were a number of changes made to the work plan since we last discussed it with the board in June. We made a number of changes to enhance what we've talked about in terms of the impacts on disadvantaged communities of climate change and how our programs might address some of those. We also put more detail in each of the program write-ups to give a fuller picture of what each program would be dealing with in the future. And then we also tried to make more robust our discussions of the data and modeling needs. So those are sort of the 3 big changes that we made since June, and then there are a number of other changes that you'll see. And then the last big thing that we did was actually to get this Section 4 together, which is the priorities and timelines for those priorities of what each of our programs might be doing. So that's what this is.
So Andrew, he does have your final presentation if you want to switch over to the right presentation.
Oh.
I don't know if you want to. or
No,
not.
I'll just keep going, but thank you. So the first is the over the short term, which we just defined as 0 to 4 years from now. So currently and through the next 4 years, there are a number of things you'll see here in the planning category. The first being the triennial review, when that comes before the board to consider climate change in that review. There's the Delta program, the Delta research, and the regional monitoring program, and those are things that can be, we'll be gathering data that can be useful in addressing climate change and establishing baselines, et cetera. CV Salts as the long-term planning program for the board will be, although it's not the focus of it, will be addressing climate change. And then again with our swamp and TMDL programs, there's will be efforts to gather surface water data and other indicators of climate change. In our surface water program for NPDES, the one thing that we will be doing in the short term is requesting voluntary climate action plans from our dischargers. And kind of working with them on that, and we've had certainly some good discussions with the stakeholders about those. And then for our WDR, our Discharge to Land program, looking at some of our older permits and updating the water balances in those and other things. The medium term, which again we've defined 3 to 7 years, there's certainly continuing action on CV salts, and some of that will relate to climate change. In terms of the surface water programs, updating some of the mitigation requirements for our 401 certification program. And then forest activities, and this is related to the presentation this morning from Pacific Forest Trust, looking at watershed-wide planning and how we do that. And that's something that is ongoing, but we'll do more of. And in fact, we'd like to incorporate that watershed-based planning into more of our programs. And then again, with the WDRs, just continue to revise the older WDRs. And then the long term. So these are things that are going to be more reliant on new data and modeling and other things that we'll gather in order to do most of these things. But again, the CV salts and its continuing efforts, basin planning, in terms of developing basin plan amendments, I think that's something that's a ways off, and we will need more data before we'll be able to propose what those might be, but that is part of what we envision. Again, on the NPDES program, updating permit requirements, and then also going from voluntary climate action plans to mandatory climate action plans. And one of the changes that we made in this section of the work plan was to make it clear that we'll be relying on the data and the things that we gather from the voluntary plans that we've seen before, working with the dischargers on these things before we have any requirements, and making sure that they're reasonable and feasible, whatever they are. This one in Title 27, that's one that should have been changed. It's actually going to be more a landfill effort on best management practices, so that bullet's a little bit inaccurate. I apologize for that. And then the same with our WDR program, looking at requiring climate action plans for adaptation. And then, of course, throughout our programs, best management practices will likely need to be changed. So we received a number of comments since we put out our work plan in October for public comment. The ones that I want to just focus on, the Central Valley Flood Control Agency, they just their main request was that we include a bit more acknowledgement about the effects of sedimentation on flood control. So we have done that, and then I'll go in a little more detail. So for the, and these comments actually apply both to the California Association of Sanitation Agencies and CIVICWA, Central Valley Clean Water Association. The first comment that they had was the need for further acknowledgement of sort of changes in flows as they relate to wastewater systems, so impacts of lower flows, increased indoor conservation and water recycling. There were concerns with the mandatory climate action plans and A, having mandatory climate action plans, and B, sort of how we develop those, and then a number of other clarifications. And then there was also concerns raised by CIVICWA, which I think you'll hear some of these from Debbie Webster, about whether we should have more acknowledgement of greenhouse gas emissions and the efforts that are being undertaken to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So in response to these comments, we did change some of the wording in the NPDES section to acknowledge the impacts of lower flows, et cetera. We did also reword the language on mandatory climate action plans that we believe addresses the concerns that were raised. We didn't make too many changes as it related to the greenhouse gas emissions issue, mostly because the board sort of limited authority in that, but we did acknowledge the fact that we will work with other state agencies who are the leads on greenhouse gas emission reductions, including the state board, who's been doing a lot of work with POTWs and others on energy efficiency. And we also, in a number of places, made it clear that our efforts should be should take into account the other impacts that these responses might have on the environment. So taking a holistic look at what we're doing and how any requirements we might have would affect the environment in other ways. And that was all I have. And so I just recommend adoption of the resolution and the work plan. And there's one late revision to the resolution that you have in front of you.
So Andrew, occurs to me there's a lot of things that this board does that has an impact on climate change, and you've gone through these and quite extensively in the past. But it strikes me that one of the big issues that I have been involved with is the release of greenhouse gases from dairy operations. Mm-hmm. So with that said, today it's something that I guess all of us have known, certainly I've known, but I think it was brought home today very forcibly by Lori Wayburn, and that was the importance of healthy forests for carbon capture. Mm-hmm. And it just strikes me that forest program could and maybe should be a very important part of the greenhouse gas, of the climate change plan we're putting together. And I know that you talk about forests there, but I guess the question is, should we be more extensive in our comments regarding the forests?
Sure, and I did. I talked with all the program managers as we were putting this together, but in specifically talking with Angela Wilson. I mean, so she and her staff are pretty engaged with the Board of Forestry and CAL FIRE, who really have the lead on the greenhouse gas reduction side, along with the Air Resources Board. And so, actually one of the changes that we did make to that section is to acknowledge the fact that we need to keep working with them as they are coming up with programs to address greenhouse gases, and so to make sure that the water quality pieces of that are also taken into account.
Healthy forests have a lot of positive benefits, and unfortunately we've lost a lot of those. That animal that John inquired on is the fisher. I brought up a picture of a fisher here. The work that was done down, and I'm glad I found out what a fisher looks like, because I've heard about the fisher in the past. The work, they've disappeared in many areas, or at least the populations have gone down. work done by National Forest Service in a test area which is on a upper watershed of the Kings River, where they've taken, they've set aside control areas, and then they had test areas there where they had a healthy forest. They found, in fact, the fisher concentration went up, bird population went up, because healthy forest, what used to live there, what used to be there, and that's where these creatures thrived. But as we know, healthy forests also don't have the fire risk, the erosion, everything that's associated with that causes significant adverse water quality issues. So I really would, in the name of the fisher, I would urge that we make every effort we can to encapsulate the kinds of measures that are spelled out that are applicable to the climate change plan that we have. Yeah. Incorporate them in that plan. Okay, any other questions?
No, I support
comments?
what Dr. Longley is saying. I think that that's an important and maybe, you know, not considered enough option for us. So, thank you.
Yes, Bob?
I just want to be cautious about what's a healthy forest. There's several different definitions out there, and I trust Angela and our staff are looking at that closely, but I think that's not an easy thing to talk about.
It's not an easy thing to talk about, but I think there's probably more agreement what's an unhealthy forest.
There you go.
And we need to move away from that.
I have one other comment, and I imagine Ms. Webster will talk about it, but it mentioned the increased algal growth as a result of some of this decreased flows. And I'm quite sensitive because we see this at Clear Lake, certainly. But there's a lot of other places, and it's not just like, oh, it's algae growth. It's like, these are toxic algae, and they're dangerous to people and animals. And so that's, I don't know how we're going to deal with that over time, but it's worth paying a lot of attention to. So thanks.
I'll hold my comments till after Debbie.
I think the algal growth issues is one we need to talk about in a later board meeting. Adam was giving me some information this morning, but I don't think here's the time and place to delve into that. I do think we need to talk about it as an item on its own. Any further comments?
It is an issue with climate change, and it does affect our regulatory program, so we are going to be keeping a close eye on it, regardless of
But we might be,
this plan.
we might have to seek legislation there.
I fully agree.
So I think we need to talk about that a little more fully.
It's a serious issue
That's
that
right.
I learned about when I was with ASC at the national level, and it's just now beginning to get the attention it needs here in California.
So, okay, any further comments by board members? If not, I'll go through the cards. I'll have a whole bunch of them here. And your name, ma'am?
So thank you. Good afternoon, Board. Debbie Webster, Central Valley Clean Water Association, and I really appreciate this. First of all, I want to just say thank you to staff and for working on this through a stakeholder process. We actually got the real look at the plan, and so I also appreciate that they were willing to work with us because of the amount of activity that we had. We needed to give our comments later. It was right before, it came out right before was due right before Thanksgiving. We weren't ready. We needed the weekend to finish it. They took them. That said, as you'll understand, if there's some areas where we haven't discussed it yet, because I know where Andrew was on Tuesday. I know, the week has been a little bit hectic. So if you hear miscommunication, that's just not miscommunication, but a little bit of differences, is because we really haven't a chance to talk. So in our comment letter, we had 4, and Dr. Longley, I'm going to need a little bit more than 3 minutes. I'm just going to tell you. I put 10 minutes down, and I think that actually might be pretty close. But no? Well, then you're going to be in trouble. So, no, just kidding. Okay, so we had 4 areas of comments, really kind of categories that I'd say is that kind of actions that we as POTWs have taken, what the work plan and the need for work plan balance and what's described, certainly the issue of climate action plans, and then statements within the work plan on future regulations. So just starting out, our POTWs in our cities have taken a lot of action. It depends on the city, it depends on either circumstance, but many of them are capturing methane rather than just flaring it, and they're using it and converting it to energy. Certainly you've seen water recycling expand in the Central Valley, and we anticipate that that's going to continue to expand. Many of our treatment plants have and collection systems have increased their pumping and operational energy efficiency. There are solar panels at many of our treatment plants because they're open space areas. We have fleet improvements. Many of them are using alternative fuels as part of their fleet. And then there's been significant collection system improvements that have happened, mostly through the sanitary sewer system, we call it, it used to be SSO, but we'll call it the SSS WDR, which is a general permit, which requires planning for that. And we saw vast improvements through these last, through the last set of storms that we had that were so much less than we would have typically seen, 10 years ago because of those improvements. And so, but what we really need to recognize is that most of these improvements that have been done are actions to reduce greenhouse gas emission and the carbon footprint. And that's really where the focus on the climate change actions within our cities and POTWs have been. What we request, and this is where I was kind of alluding to maybe a difference in communication, is that we really feel like the work plan really needs to recognize that balance, when you guys do consideration, is really necessary because you take actions that have climate change, i.e. carbon footprint impacts. You take actions that where there's a balance between, this might get you water quality improvement, but this has really huge impacts. So for example, these flexibility, and in order to address that, what we're saying is that it should be considered, it should be acknowledged, and maybe that we're going to need some flexibility, somewhat like we've developed within CV salts. So I don't know why I'm on this one, but I missed part of my notes in here. But so some examples that I would give is let's say you go for a more stringent limit because we're concerned about water. I'm going to use I'm not going to use temperature yet. That then translates to higher levels of treatment. That translates to higher energy uses. That translates to a higher carbon footprint. So balancing, when you look at all the other factors that you're required to look at, balancing that impact on climate and what's reasonable as part of water quality regulation is something that I think that this board can do and make a commitment to do. Those kind of things happen in our basin planning, they happen in permitting. There's also times where it's like, ooh, which one is better? So for example, I'm going to give you 2 examples. So we look at temperature and there's a recommendation to maybe look at temperature criteria. Well, for us, temperature criteria might mean that we need to put cooling towers, which is additional energy to put there, but maybe the better thing to do is do trees. But even if you do trees, the temperature might change and we still may need cooling powers. But how can we as a society work towards the best solution for water quality planning? And that's what I'm talking about when I talk about regulatory flexibility. There's other actions like if we talked a little bit, or you heard earlier, and I thought that was a great presentation, about how sometimes we harden our facilities in order to protect them against flooding and things like that, but that can actually have negative impacts on the water and the environment of our streams. So these are the kind of balances that we need to take into an account. And unfortunately, what a lot of the plan focuses on, how can the Water Board regulate more and regulate our programs more versus how can we work towards a better solution. And so that was where my change was going and where my some of what we were trying to do, and really in the resolution trying to direct that that look at the balance, and let's look at what we need to do to get to the end together. And I think that our climate, I think that the legislation is like that because it does focus on looking at impacts as a whole and having the cities look at it whole and working together through local, regional, and state government and even federal government on how we can all work together to try to get to a solution versus more of a, oh, we're going to make you do this and then we're going to make you do that. So that was one of the areas that we were asking for a request or made a request. On the climate action plans, that is a requirement right now. There's a voluntary component to it. Certainly agree with the voluntary component. Let's look at it. Let's see what these plans said. That said, is many of them are online, and I have looked at them and seen what they say. They are really, again, focused on reducing greenhouse gas footprint. The POTWs typically, if they're even mentioned, are less than 2% of the overall footprint, but they do mention some of the things that I mentioned that I mentioned ahead of time on ways that we're doing improvement. What they don't do is go on into resiliency. What are we going to do if this flood comes? What if these different things that were brought up in the work plan of these are the things that were needed for climate action plans. And the concern that I have is not necessarily the voluntary nature of what we're doing and trying to get an idea of what we need to do in the future, but the mandatory nature that is described in the plan. We need to know what, and I appreciate some of the language changes because it talks about learning from that, but there's still this mandate. And the question for me is does it need to be a mandate, or is it, let's figure out in the future if we need to mandate it? And can we change that language to go to that? Just to let you know, some of the climate action plans that have been done under a stakeholder process through the cities, through many different groups. They have received grants to do them, energy grants to do them, and so the cost, or at least some of the costs, have been absorbed through other areas. In this case, we're talking about that not happening, and those climate action plans can be $250,000 to $1 million plus just to develop. And I'm extremely concerned that our board saying that this is going to be mandated without really knowing what they are and what they're going to entail and what level is going to be required gives me angst, especially with many of our communities. And so my recommendation within within the work plan would be to soften that language. We may consider doing that in the future. We're going to look at that. That's going to be the plan versus we're going to have mandatory plans. We will do these. There's several places within the plan that I think that information's necessary. But also one of the concerns is, go ahead.
Let me stop you there. Andrew, I'd like to have you reply to the comment about this would be adoption of this is tantamount to putting a mandatory requirement on that it costs a huge amount to satisfy.
So I will defer a little bit to the council on this particular one, but I will say I don't think we're committing the board to a particular regulatory action in this case. What we are committing the board to is, or board staff to in particular, is to work towards getting those mandatory plans. And I do think that, and again, this is on the longest term, part of the plan, and it will likely, I think, change as we get more information. But I do think it will be important that in some ways we need to ensure that our facilities, especially the POTWs, are prepared for some of the changes that will accompany climate change. And so the thought was that I think this is part of our discussion with Debbie and others, was that they wouldn't necessarily be standalone plans. They could be part of what a county or a city are doing. And at this point, there are a number of efforts with counties and cities to do climate change adaptation planning. So the idea that we had was that in the future, parts of those plans would include how POTWs and others would respond, and they would be part of a holistic plan that would take into account, many things.
Right, without softening the requirement, would it be possible to incorporate some of that language as it gets to making it much more doable, if you will?
So Carl, let me jump in. Thanks, Andrew. This is something we did talk about in the stakeholder process, and I think we did both soften it a little bit in that it's not going to be, in our view, it wasn't going to be a mandate to do a whole cloth new project, and it could be incorporated from if you had a larger county or city plan. Also, it wouldn't be required till after there's a requirement on us to relook at this plan itself. So I think that, I'd be more comfortable having that review in 5 years for us before it's mandated. It's still 2 years or more before it's mandated on you, rather than softening it now and then, so.
I wasn't looking at it being softened. I was looking at more direction given at this point.
So Dr. Longley, this was a conversation Andrew and I had in result, and unfortunately, John, we didn't bring you into this conversation, but I felt that this plan was important, that it put people on notice that there may be absolute requirements that come at them as a result. And this isn't just a plan about greenhouse gas and carbon footprint. It's a plan about looking at your facilities to make sure that since we're going to be seeing these more extreme precipitation events, that maybe these facilities that we have adequate protection in so that the public aren't exposed to them if they are flooded or overrun with stormwater, that they're adequately protected from these new extreme events. So there's all this other stuff associated with climate change that could impact our facilities and the public safety that we need to have them look at and evaluate, and that could result in changes to their orders to direct them to make changes. And so, and I think we worked a lot to incorporate the fact for greenhouse gas and carbon footprint that anything that's imposed, we look at it in a holistic manner to make sure we're not causing, or exchanging, doing something here to make it worse somewhere else. So we've added that language in here. But I think it would be unfair to you and the people you represent to soften this language to think that somehow in the future this is just a plan that maybe might end up in something. I think I'd prefer to have your constituents be put on notice that they're most likely going to be seeing some changes as a result of things happening in the environment.
So let me respond, because one of the issues that I actually was going to get to next is, again, when we talk about funding. And our permits require typically that these not just be like a information, have I checked this? But if you do a plan, have it done through an engineer, depending upon what's required. This could be significantly expensive. And by having it be a requirement, we kind of get through this balance of sometimes you have a benefit, because if you're going to do a project, you're going to put in a new facility to look at climate impact and build for it at that point, or a new part of a facility, absolutely makes sense. And the State Water Board, through the Department of through their Clean Water State Revolving Fund, are allowing that look. But when we start mandating stuff, using things like SEPs or we can't use them anymore because they're mandated by some other way, and that's the concern. I'm completely concerned on how we're going to do this in light of our other demands with CV salts, with our other financing demands, all these different things. I'm very, very concerned about that, and that's why I feel like the process I feel like at this point, not giving the notice that yes, that might happen, but looking at it and really setting up a process of let's look at this. What are we going to really ask for? What are the ways that we can ask for it that is not necessarily do we need a plan in every case? And then I'm now sorry because I'm going to get to the last part of it, is that there's these inferences within the plan about different types of requirements. So in our current WDRs, typically you're protecting to the 100-year flood level, and that's reasonable, and that's been historically what you do. And we get it. The 100-year flood level has changed. We don't know what the predicted is going to be in the future, But when we get, there's statements in there about how POTWs are going to have to be able to, to take care of extreme events, the cost, the requirements, what does that mean? Really, are we putting billions and billions of dollars in this little plan without having really the thought and the process that is built into things without doing it? So those are where some of our concerns are. And I get there's a lot of yin and yang about this, but I want to say is it's not like our communities aren't going out there and aren't doing stuff. There are some that, and I agree with that recommendation. There's very old WDRs that have requirements that you have to meet the 100-year flood level. Does it meet it now? We don't know. And they're going to have to do some work to figure that part out.
That's what the plan is all about, Debbie. It's not about saying right now, today, we know what your solution's going to be, and that the board in the future, without me or whoever's sitting in this chair next year, that they're going to be unreasonable and ask you to do $1 billion improvement when it's not necessary. I think the board will have a lot of discretion around what goes into these plans. The fact is we're just telling you there will be a requirement that has a plan requirement that tells the board what you're planning to do and why you aren't going to be doing certain things. It's not saying what has to be done in the plan. It's just saying there will be a plan developed.
So I understand that too. And one of the questions that also came up, so if we do that, one of the questions that came up from our membership was, okay, so if we have a plan that identifies these needs, we don't have the financing, how is that going to be taken care of? Do we have that ability and resiliency to be able to do that? And if we don't, what's the consequences?
They could be the same whether it's a new effluent limit or a new federal requirement on your facilities. Those are questions that have to be addressed at the time at what the total cost would be. So those are good questions. They're very big concerns, and where the funding will come from, that's a question today for anything we do. But to say we shouldn't ask that people look at these things and tell the board what the potential impacts could be, which is what the essence of a mandatory climate plan would be about, then how the board can't be informed on what the problem is. So it has to happen. The planning has to take place. We can't just turn a blind eye to it.
And the one thing I will add is we did try to be cognizant of the fact that there could be costs and and we added language about these things need to be reasonable and feasible. And so we did add that just for the boards.
I was going to say, I saw that in the CV salts section because we did that, but I didn't. You did? Okay, I didn't see
Under the
that.
mandatory, it's been added under the mandatory language. It says here that any such mandatory plan requirements will be developed based on knowledge gained from the previous voluntary plan and work with the dischargers. And there's a need to both employ holistic approaches, which acknowledges and accounts for all potential benefits and harms to the environment, along with recognizing the needs for plans which are reasonable and feasible.
Okay. Anyways, I would, I'm not kind of going, I'm going to just tell you, my concerns remain when you put language, this will be mandatory, before we really know what they are, before we really know what they're doing. I understand the notice. I understand and don't necessarily disagree with the idea that we're going to try to work to see what we need to do. It's how it's written. And so that's.
Is that your testimony? Just a little thing you were going to bring in front of us. Okay.
I was going to say, well, no. When you were like, "Oh, we can do it in 10 minutes," I'm like, because this is a big deal. And as I said, it's like, oh, well, we'll start with the POTWs, and it's like
going to take you at least an hour or so.
Oh, well, no, I don't want to do an hour, but
Okay.
I do think that there's ways that would be better to do this, and so I am recommending that we come with alternative language on some of those things that has the spirit of what Pamela is asking to do, is to put people on notice, but doesn't mandate it at this point and really hasn't set those parameters.
It's mandated with the qualifiers, reasonable and feasible.
No, the
And-
action plans are reasonable, feasible, but it doesn't say you're not going to do a mandated thing, which we're already talking about being a significant financial impact on our communities that we don't even know if what is needed and what's going to be included and how we're going to do that in the light of things that we're trying to do, because we'll be right when that 8-year time frame comes through, we'll be right in the middle of those priority areas for CV salts. So it's a, you know, really it's a resources question too. And
No, we understand-
And,
we
and what's the
understand that.
priority?
We understand that, and that's the reasonable and feasible. Includes that, I would think. Are there any questions or comments by members of the board? I want to thank you for your testimony. Once again, you get us scratching our heads. Any other
brief
interested
comment.
persons? See none, we'll go to closing statement by staff.
Our only closing statement is we recommend the board adopt the resolution.
Very good. We'll close the hearing, deliberation and voting on the proposed resolution. Do I have a motion?
Yeah, I'll absolutely make the motion to approve this, but I certainly want to hear other board member comments.
Okay, we have a motion. Do I have a
And-
second?
And I'm sorry, Board Member Costantino with the late revision to
With the late holistic revisions, yes.
Okay. And do I have a second?
I'd be proud to
John-
second.
John moved, Carmen seconded. Comments?
I just, you know, the recognizing the complexities when you're dealing with multimedia aspects of this, in terms of providing the most effective climate change resiliency adaptation policy and actions is really important. And I think also moving forward is critically important. But I always come back to this, and the board always has, when we start running into these multimedia situations where we're trying to make a decision based on one item and it affects other items, whether it's air quality or, you know, those are always complex. But I think that the work's been done here reflects that. I appreciate the late additions, and I'm going to be supporting this. Thanks.
I'd like to see more language about variation and risk. To me, that's really what it's about. And then also, as we implement, do it within the existing regulations we already have rather than set up a whole different set.
I mean, I understand the hugeness of what this is. I wrote down world peace. It's like, you know, wanting world peace and just trying to figure out how to get it. I mean, this is a big deal, and it's a worthy goal, and I'm glad that we're going to try to take it on. But I trust that, you know, staff and the board will be reasonable and sensitive, and that's why I feel confident in, even with Ms. Webster's concerns, of still going forward with this.
World peace, we can do that in an hour or two. Any other comments?
So, Debbie, thank you for being part of the process. Thank you for coming today and expressing those concerns, which are real. I mean, anything that this board requires takes dollars. And you brought up the timing issue. It's sort of a compounding issue. If in 8 years, this is exactly when you're right in the middle of CV salts, maybe that's not the perfect time to overlay this. But that's the time to start thinking about the mandate. And so, you know, and it's more complicated than carbon footprint, right? It's adaptation and resiliency and everything you mentioned. But if folks aren't thinking about it, then no one's thinking about it. So I think that's one of the big things in this is that, you know, we're asking folks to think about climate in water quality. And, you know, Pamela's almost done being the boss around here, but when I first got appointed, she came to my office, which I thought was great, and she wanted to meet me, and the first thing she said was, "I'm really happy there's someone who knows about climate coming on board." And then I asked her, "What's the board currently doing about climate?" And she said, "Nothing." And it was because it was, 6, 7 years ago, AB 32 was just getting going really, but that was 6, 7 years ago. We can't today, at the end of today, we can't still say we're not doing anything on climate. So we put together this plan. We had some good stakeholder feedback. I want to thank Andrew and Jeff for putting it together. As with any plan, it's a start. Is it perfect? Maybe not, but there was an effort to reach out to every division, every program, and I talked to Andrew many times about we got to go back to everybody because we didn't get quite the answers we were looking for. They didn't put enough thought into it. So there was a lot of thought. And when you think about climate, it sort of is all-encompassing. And when you think about this board, everything from landfills to soils to irrigated lands, and then when you sort of try and do a matrix, that becomes a big deal. And to distill it down to something that's readable, I thought was a really impressive feat. So I'm certainly supportive of this, and the timing happens to be next week. The scoping plan is going to be up for readoption, and that's in every 5 year. So maybe we're in a nice cycle that when you're on the mitigation side, you think about the water quality side. And Tam's here, and I know the state board has made their resolution, and they're on it. And I guess my final thing, I want to thank the board for the board members for the support and let me sort of take this on a little bit. But at the WKCC, we had climate data guys. I mean, the guys with the real numbers, and that was scary stuff. And Lori sort of highlighted it, but when the PhDs are showing you the numbers and things look like they're really going the wrong way, it sort of inspires you to keep fighting the fight a little bit. So with that, I appreciate the support, and I'll be obviously voting for this.
Thank you, John. And I too will be supporting this. If I wasn't before or after listening to you, I am. Are there any further comments? Call the roll, please.
Mr. Costantino?
Aye.
Ms. Ramirez? Yes. Ms. Brar?
Yes.
Mr. Schneider? Dr. Markham?
Aye.
Ms. Kadara? Dr. Longley?
Yes.
Motion carries.
This board will be going into executive session.
Yeah, that's correct, Dr. Longley. This board will meet in closed section to consider personnel matters pursuant to Government Code Section 11126, Subdivision A, and to receive advice from legal counsel regarding matters in litigation pursuant to Government Code Section 11126, Subdivision E. The two pieces of litigation that the board will be discussing are identified in the board's agenda as agenda items F and O under the closed session heading.
Thank you. So we will recess and re-adjourn back in the conference room.
Yeah, and we will come back into this board meeting to close the hearing.
We'll close this board meeting when we're finished. Thank you.